They say in New Orleans, the dead never truly leave. Welcome to the French Quarter, where behind every elegant facade and wrought-iron balcony lies centuries of restless spirits. Tonight, you'll check into 13 of the most haunted hotel rooms in the Big Easy, places where guests have checked out, but never really left. Prepare yourself as we count down these terrifying encounters. Will you make it to morning, or will you become part of the permanent guest registry? The Hotel Monteleone stands like a sentinel on Royal Street in New Orleans, its Baroque facade watching over the French Quarter since 1886. Behind its ornate exterior lie 130 years of history, some recorded in ledgers and photographs, others whispered between staff in hushed tones after midnight. Among these whispers, the legend of Room 327 persists with unusual tenacity. Unlike many ghost stories that fade with time, the tale of the bride who never left seems to grow stronger with each passing decade. The story begins in 1923 with a young couple deeply in love. Clara and James Montgomery arrived at the Monteleone for their honeymoon, having chosen New Orleans for its romance and mystique. Clara, barely 20 and raised in Boston's rigid social circles, had defied her parents to marry James, a talented musician from Memphis with little fortune but boundless charm. Their wedding had been small but joyous, and the Monteleone represented their first steps into a future they would build together. Historical records confirm that on the evening of March 5, 1923, the newlyweds checked into room 327, a corner suite with tall windows overlooking Royal Street. What happened after that initial check-in becomes clouded in tragedy. According to hotel records, James Montgomery rushed down to the lobby at 3:42 a.m., his nightclothes disheveled, crying for a doctor. His young bride had awakened with chest pains and couldn't breathe. Dr. William Lassiter, staying 2 floors below, responded quickly but could do nothing. Clara Montgomery, née Weatherly, was pronounced dead at 4:17 a.m. from what was later determined to be an undiagnosed heart condition. She died in the antique 4-poster bed, still wearing her pearl drop earrings, a wedding gift from James. The death certificate exists in city archives, a faded document testifying to a life cut tragically short. What doesn't appear in official records is what happened next. James reportedly refused to leave the room for 3 days. Hotel staff brought him food that remained untouched. When he finally emerged, according to employee accounts from that era, he was transformed. His hair had whitened at the temples, and his eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had traveled far beyond grief. Perhaps most disturbing was what James told the hotel manager before checking out. "She's still in there. She doesn't know she's gone." He left behind Clara's wedding ring on the nightstand, saying she wanted it to stay where they had been happy. The ring disappeared shortly afterward, though no theft was ever reported. For decades, that might have been the end of the story: a tragic honeymoon, a grieving husband, a room with sad memories. But then the occurrences began. In 1927, a housekeeper refused to clean room 327 alone, claiming she heard a woman softly crying while making the bed. By 1934, multiple guests had requested room changes after reporting the scent of orange blossom perfume, Clara's signature fragrance, appearing suddenly in the middle of the night. The phenomena surrounding room 327 follow patterns unusual even for haunted locations. Unlike many spectral manifestations that seem random or tied to anniversary dates, Clara's presence seems most active when newlyweds or honeymooning couples occupy the room. It's as though she's drawn to what she lost, the beginning of a marriage that never had the chance to unfold. Margaret Wilcox, who worked as a concierge at the Monteleone from 1952 to 1971, kept a private journal of guest experiences. In it, she documented over 30 incidents involving room 327. The most common report was of belongings being rearranged, particularly jewelry. Women would leave necklaces or earrings on the vanity, only to find them carefully arranged in heart patterns by morning. But what transformed Clara from a sad historical footnote to one of the Monteleone's most famous residents were the photographs. In 1968, a couple from Chicago captured what appears to be a female figure in a white nightgown standing by the room's window, her outline translucent but her features surprisingly distinct. The photograph, analyzed by skeptics and believers alike, has never been conclusively debunked. The Hotel Monteleone has weathered hurricanes, economic downturns, and changing travel habits, yet throughout it all, Room 327 has maintained its reputation as the most requested, haunted accommodation they offer. The management, once reluctant to acknowledge their spectral resident, now embraces Clara's legend as part of the hotel's rich tapestry of stories. But there's something about Clara that feels different from commercial ghost tourism, something genuine that resonates with those who encounter her presence. What keeps Clara Montgomery tethered to Room 327? Is it the shock of her sudden passing, or something deeper, the promise of a life unlived, a marriage unconsummated? Perhaps the true mystery isn't that she never left, but why, after a century, she still waits. The Montgomery family records reveal that James never remarried. He returned to Memphis, abandoned his musical career, and lived a quiet, solitary life until his death in 1976 at age 77. Before he died, he made a request that seemed odd to his few remaining relatives. He asked to have a pearl necklace sent to the Hotel Monteleone with instructions that it be placed in Room 327. The package arrived with a simple note. "For Clara. I've kept my promise." The hotel manager, unsure what to do with such an unusual request, placed the pearls in a drawer in Room 327. By morning, they had vanished. No one had entered the room during the night according to security records. The pearls were never seen again. This incident marked a turning point in Clara's manifestations. The subtle phenomena, moved objects, phantom perfume, fleeting reflections in mirrors, intensified. Guests began reporting dreams of a young woman showing them her wedding album, the pages turning though no one touched them. Others claimed to wake and find a depression on the edge of their bed, as though someone had been sitting there watching them sleep. Room 327 holds a curious distinction in paranormal research. Dr. Eleanor Hayes from Tulane University's defunct parapsychology department conducted the longest continuous monitoring of a reportedly haunted hotel room there in 1983. For 30 consecutive days, she recorded temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic readings, and audio samples. The data showed something researchers still struggle to explain. The room consistently registered as 35 degrees cooler than adjacent rooms, despite sharing the same heating system. But the true evidence of Clara's enduring presence comes not from scientific instruments, but from the experiences of couples who stay in her domain. Maria and Carlos Jimenez checked into Room 327 for their honeymoon in 1992, unaware of its reputation. On their second night, Maria awoke to find her wedding veil, which had been packed away in their suitcase, laid out carefully on the bed. Next to it lay a single pearl earring, not hers, which vanished when she reached for it. "It never felt threatening," Maria later told a local newspaper. "It felt congratulatory, like someone happy for us but sad for herself." The most compelling accounts come from women who arrive at Room 327 in emotional distress. In 2004, Rebecca Langley checked in after canceling her own wedding. She'd discovered her fiancé's infidelity 2 days before the ceremony and fled to New Orleans to escape her embarrassment and heartbreak. She chose the Monteleone randomly, knew nothing of Clara or Room 327, which was assigned to her by chance. On her second night, Rebecca woke at exactly 3:42 a.m., the time James Montgomery had rushed downstairs for help. She felt a pressure on her hand, as though someone was holding it. Then, Rebecca claims she heard a woman's voice, clear but distant. "Love comes again. Don't close your door." Rebecca Langley left New Orleans the next morning and, within a year, met the man who would become her husband. They returned to Room 327 every anniversary, leaving behind a single pearl in the nightstand drawer, a gift for Clara. What sets Clara apart from other hotel haunts is the specificity of her interactions. She appears to understand the emotional states of those who enter her domain, responding differently to honeymooners than to those traveling alone. She seems, in some fundamental way, to still be the young bride she was in life, hopeful, romantic, and attuned to the hearts of others. the hotel staff maintain a special relationship with their permanent resident. Housekeepers often speak to Clara while cleaning room 327, updating her on hotel gossip or world events. Many refuse to change the room's decor too drastically, believing Clara prefers things reminiscent of her era. A small vase of orange blossoms is often placed on the dresser, both an acknowledgement and a welcome. In 2018, during renovations that modernized much of the hotel, room 327 was scheduled for completely new furnishings. The antique four-poster bed, possibly the very one Clara died in, was to be replaced with a more contemporary piece. 3 workers entered to dismantle it. Within minutes, all 3 developed severe headaches and dizziness. One described feeling a hand firmly push against his chest when he touched the bed frame. They left the room to recover, and when they returned, their tools had been neatly arranged on the floor to spell "No." The hotel management decided to restore the original bed instead of replacing it. Since that decision, guests report Clara's presence seems more peaceful, less prone to moving objects or creating cold spots. She appears, by all accounts, satisfied with this concession to her preferences. What compels us about Clara's story isn't just the supernatural elements, but its profound humanity. In her unending vigil in room 327, we recognize the universal fear of dreams interrupted and futures stolen. We understand the desire to remain where we were happiest, to watch others experience the joy that was taken from us. As the Hotel Monteleone enters its 2nd century, Clara Montgomery remains its most faithful guest. Her story continues to evolve as new encounters are reported, each adding another layer to her mystery. Paranormal investigators have captured EVP recordings of a soft female voice humming what musicians identify as a popular wedding song from the 1920s. Thermal imaging cameras occasionally detect a cool human-shaped outline near the windows, gazing out at the city that Clara barely had time to know. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this haunting is its essential loneliness. Despite a century of witnesses, Clara remains separated from human connection by the veil between life and death. She reaches across this divide with scents and touches, with moved objects and whispered messages, seeking the connection that was stolen from her on her honeymoon night. For those who believe her story, Clara Montgomery's presence raises a question that extends beyond ghost stories into the realm of what makes us human. What emotion, what connection could be powerful enough to bind someone to a place for 100 years? And if love can tether a spirit to room 327 for a century, what else might it be capable of accomplishing across the boundaries we believe unbreachable? The Bourbon Orleans Hotel stands as a silent witness to centuries of New Orleans history, its walls absorbing whispers of tragedies and triumphs alike. But among the many souls said to haunt its elegant corridors, none commands more fascination than the specter of Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen who once held the city in her mystical grip. Her presence lingers in the shadows of this historic establishment, a phantom echo of antebellum New Orleans that refuses to fade into obscurity. Those who work the night shifts speak in hushed tones about unexplained footsteps trailing behind them, the sensation of invisible hands arranging items in vacant rooms, and the faint scent of gris-gris potions that sometimes permeates the air without explanation. The hotel itself began not as a place of lodging but as a grand ballroom in 1817, a glittering social hub where the elite of New Orleans society danced and schemed beneath crystal chandeliers. Years later, it transformed into the Orleans Theater and Ballroom, hosting operas and masquerade balls that became legendary throughout the American South. But beneath the veneer of high society churned darker currents. The building later housed the Sisters of the Holy Family Convent, where young women took vows of chastity and poverty, some perhaps hiding from pasts too painful to face. The contrast between opulent revelry and austere devotion created a spiritual dissonance that clings to the property even now, a pendulum swinging between indulgence and penance. Marie Laveau walked these grounds during her lifetime, though accounts differ on why. Some historical records suggest she attended the balls, moving like smoke among the white aristocracy who both feared and sought her powers. Others claim she came later, when the building served as a convent and orphanage, offering her healing knowledge to the sisters who cared for abandoned children. What remains certain is that her influence extended throughout every stratum of New Orleans society, from the mansions of wealthy planters to the humble cottages of freed slaves. Her power transcended racial and class boundaries in a way almost unheard of for a woman of color in the 1800s, and perhaps this extraordinary social fluidity explains why her spirit seems equally at home in the elegant ballroom as in the servants' quarters of the Bourbon Orleans. Night manager Eliza Thibodeau never believed in ghosts until she began working at the Bourbon Orleans 3 years ago. A pragmatic woman with a degree in hotel management and a healthy skepticism toward the supernatural, she dismissed the ghost stories as clever marketing tactics designed to attract tourists to the hotel. Then came the night she was completing her rounds on the 6th floor, checking that all was in order before the morning shift arrived. The air around her suddenly turned cold, not the artificial chill of air conditioning but a penetrating cold that seemed to reach into her bones. A woman's voice, low and melodious with the distinct cadence of Creole French, whispered something unintelligible just behind her right ear. When Eliza spun around, the hallway stretched empty in both directions, the antique sconces casting pools of gentle light that illuminated nothing unusual. Yet she couldn't shake the certainty that something, had just attempted communication. What transpired over the following months transformed Eliza from skeptic to reluctant believer. Items in locked rooms rearranged themselves overnight. Guests reported dreams of a striking woman with a tignon wrapped around her head, offering them advice or warnings about personal matters she couldn't possibly know. Most compelling was the night a seamstress's mannequin appeared in the center of the ballroom at 3 a.m., draped with beads and feathers in the traditional style of voodoo altars. Security cameras showed no one entering the space, yet there it stood, an impossible artifact that seemed to mock the very concept of rational explanation. But the question remained, if this truly was Marie Laveau's spirit, what kept her bound to this particular building? What unfinished business could be powerful enough to hold the voodoo queen in this world nearly 140 years after her death? The morning dawned gray and heavy with moisture, the kind of thick Louisiana humidity that clings to skin like a desperate lover. Eliza sat across from Professor Marcus Broussard in the hotel's courtyard, the wrought-iron table between them cluttered with historical documents, photographs, and the professor's ever-present cup of chicory coffee. A respected historian specializing in New Orleans folklore at Tulane University, Broussard had responded to her email with surprising enthusiasm. Now, surrounded by the hotel's lush foliage and the gentle splash of the fountain, he examined her documentation of the strange occurrences with scholarly intensity. The Bourbon Orleans sits at a peculiar confluence of energies, Broussard explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. It exists in what the voodoo practitioners would call a crossroads, a place where different worlds touch. His fingers traced the outline of an old map showing the original property boundaries. Here, where the ballroom stood, was once the site of ceremonies conducted under Marie Laveau's guidance. The wealthy and powerful came to her secretly, seeking blessings for business ventures or curses for their enemies. Eliza leaned forward, captivated despite her lingering skepticism. But why would she still be here? According to the records, she never lived in this building. But attachment to place isn't always about residence, Broussard countered, his eyes brightening with academic passion. Laveau understood power, not just mystical power, but social influence. In antebellum New Orleans, information was currency, and she amassed it like a banker hoards gold. The secrets she collected at these society gatherings would have been invaluable to her practice. A hotel maid approached their table, her expression hesitant as she interrupted their conversation. "Miss Thibodeau? Room 644. Something's happened again." The woman's hands trembled slightly as she twisted her cleaning cloth. "All the dresser drawers, they're open. And there's a pattern made with small white stones on the bed. I swear I just cleaned that room, and it was empty when I left." Professor Broussard's eyebrows raised with interest. "White stones. May I see?" The three made their way to the 6th floor, the elevator rising with an almost reluctant groan. The hallway stretched before them, its crimson carpet muffling their footsteps as they approached room 644. When Eliza unlocked the door, the scene inside sent a chill racing along her spine. Each drawer of the antique mahogany dresser stood open at precisely the same angle, as if positioned by a meticulous hand. But it was the arrangement on the bed that commanded their attention. Dozens of small white pebbles formed an intricate circular pattern, with strange symbols inside that Eliza didn't recognize. "This," Broussard whispered, his academic detachment momentarily forgotten, "is a veuve, a sacred symbol in voodoo used to call forth the loa, the spirits." He circled the bed carefully, studying the design without touching it. "This particular pattern is associated with Damballa, the serpent deity representing wisdom and knowledge." His finger hovered above one section of the pattern. "And here, intertwined with it, the symbol of Ursula Frida, the loa of love." The maid crossed herself quickly. "I didn't touch anything, Miss Thibodeau. I swear it." "I believe you, Claudette," Eliza assured her, though her mouth had gone dry. "Professor, what does this mean? Is someone playing an elaborate prank?" Broussard shook his head slowly. "These symbols are too authentic, too precisely rendered to be the work of a casual prankster. This is the work of someone with deep knowledge of traditional voodoo practices." He met Eliza's gaze directly. "Or perhaps it's her way of communicating more clearly, now that she knows you're paying attention." A guest was scheduled to check into this room within hours. Eliza would need to have housekeeping reset everything, discreetly remove the stones, and ensure no trace of this bizarre tableau remained. Yet something stayed her hand, a reluctance to dismantle what felt inexplicably like an important message. Standing in the doorway, she felt caught between worlds: the practical demands of hotel management and the unsettling possibility that Marie Laveau was attempting to reach across the veil for purposes yet unknown. "What?" Eliza asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does she want from me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but vibrating with potential, as a sudden breeze from the unopened window scattered the white stones across the crimson bedspread like stars falling from their constellations. As darkness embraced the French Quarter, Eliza found herself alone in the Bourbon Orleans ballroom, sitting cross-legged on the polished floor where generations had danced, celebrated, and schemed. After consulting with Professor Broussard, she had decided on this unorthodox approach, a quiet invitation to whatever presence might be lingering in the historic space. Around her, she'd arranged items Broussard suggested: a glass of rum, a small bowl of cornmeal, 7 white candles forming a circle. Not quite a voodoo ritual. Eliza lacked both the knowledge and cultural right to perform such ceremonies, but a respectful acknowledgement of Marie Laveau's traditions and beliefs. "I'm listening," Eliza said to the empty room, feeling simultaneously foolish and frightened. "If you have something to show me, I'm here to see it." For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The candles flickered occasionally from air currents in the large room, but no spectral figure materialized. No disembodied voice whispered ancient secrets. Eliza's practical nature began reasserting itself. Perhaps the stone arrangement had been a prank after all. Maybe a hotel employee with knowledge of voodoo symbolism was amusing themselves at her expense. She started to rise, her knees stiff from sitting on the hard floor. That's when she noticed the temperature dropping precipitously. Her breath became visible, little clouds of condensation forming in the suddenly frigid air. One by one, the candle flames elongated, stretching upward like reaching fingers before extinguishing simultaneously, leaving only thin ribbons of smoke curling toward the ceiling. In the darkness, the ballroom transformed. Shadow figures seemed to move around her, ghostly dancers performing to music only they could hear. Eliza remained frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "These walls remember everything," came a voice, accented and melodious, from everywhere and nowhere. "The deals made in corners, the hearts broken on this floor, the futures sold for momentary pleasure." The voice drew closer, seeming to circle Eliza as she remained rooted to the spot. "You wonder why I remain? I remain because this place was power. Is power." Eliza gathered her courage, focusing on controlling her trembling voice. "Marie Laveau?" A soft laugh, tinged with something that might have been bitterness. "They call many ghosts by my name in this city. Some are me. Some are others who came before and after. Names have power, Sherry. Be careful how you use them. The shadowy dancers continued their soundless waltz around the edges of Eliza's vision, never quite solid enough to make out distinct features. At the center of the room, however, a figure gradually coalesced, a tall woman with proud posture, wearing a tignon wrapped elaborately around her head and a dress that spoke of another century. Her face remained partially obscured, but her eyes caught the dim light filtering in from the street, reflecting it back with unnatural intensity. The hotel, Eliza managed. Why do you disturb it? What do you want? The figure moved closer, her steps making no sound on the wooden floor. Want? The dead want what the living forget. Remembrance. Truth. The apparition gestured toward the walls. They renovate, they repair, they erase. Each layer of paint covers another story. Each new carpet hides another secret. The air was thick with tension in the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel on a moonless February night. Governor Jackson Pierce stood at the window of Suite 412, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass. Below him, the French Quarter hummed with nightlife, but up here, a different kind of energy crackled. He checked his watch, 11:55 p.m., and straightened his tie. The crystal tumbler in his hand caught the amber glow of the table lamp as ice cubes clinked against glass. He wasn't a drinking man, but tonight was different. Tonight required liquid courage. A soft knock broke the silence. Pierce set down his drink and crossed the plush carpet to the door, each step measured and deliberate. When he opened it, the man who stood before him wore no expression at all, a practiced blank slate. Mr. Blackwood, Pierce said, extending his hand. The visitor's grip was cold and firm, his eyes calculating as they swept the room for threats or recording devices. Satisfied, he entered, closing the door behind him with barely a sound. I trust you came alone, Blackwood said, removing his leather gloves finger by finger. His voice was precise, cultured, with a hint of something foreign beneath the practiced American accent. He declined the offered drink with a slight wave of his hand and took a seat in a high-backed chair, positioning himself so he could see both the door and the window. The governor nodded. As agreed. He returned to the window, unable to meet the man's gaze directly. Outside, a jazz melody floated up from somewhere on Royal Street, the improvised notes a chaotic contrast to the methodical conversation unfolding in the suite. I've reviewed your proposal. The numbers are substantial. Pierce's fingers drummed against the windowsill. Blackwood remained motionless except for his eyes, which tracked the governor's movements with predatory focus. The Gulf Coast Recovery Fund represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity, Governor. $40 billion is a large pool with many tributaries. He paused, allowing the metaphor to sink in. Some of those tributaries can flow wherever we direct them. The antique clock on the mantel ticked away seconds that felt like hours. Pierce had risen from humble beginnings to the governor's mansion through hard work and clean politics, or so the public believed. But the re-election campaign was burning through cash, and his opponent was pulling ahead in the polls. Political survival, he had learned, sometimes required compromise. The question was, how much of his soul was he willing to trade? 20% is too high, Pierce said finally, turning to face Blackwood. I can't hide that much diversion from the auditors. 10% is my limit. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice remained steady, determined not to show weakness. A thin smile cracked Blackwood's stoic facade. 15, he countered. And we handled the auditors. They'll find nothing but perfectly legitimate expenditures, I assure you. He leaned forward, shadows playing across his angular features. $6 billion can disappear into consulting fees, environmental studies, administrative costs. The bureaucratic labyrinth swallows money whole and leaves no trail. The governor moved to the minibar and poured another drink, buying time. This wasn't just political survival anymore. It was a Faustian bargain written in federal aid dollars. Behind him, Blackwood waited with the patience of a spider. What the governor didn't realize was that patience came from certainty. Blackwood had recordings of their previous conversations, insurance that Pierce couldn't back out. "Let's be clear about something," Pierce said, swirling the liquor in his glass before taking a sip. "I need guarantees that none of this touches my office. If there's even a whisper of impropriety..." Blackwood cut him off with a raised hand. "Governor, discretion is our specialty. This conversation never happened. The paperwork will be immaculate. Your signature will appear only on legitimate documents." He removed a slim folder from his briefcase. "All we need is your approval on these initial project assessments. The mechanism is already in place." As midnight chimed from the clock, Pierce took the folder with trembling fingers. The weight of it seemed impossibly heavy for such a thin stack of papers. $6 billion diverted from hurricane victims, from infrastructure, from people who had lost everything. Yet as he stared at the signature line, his pen hovered, suspended between integrity and ambition. What neither man had noticed was the waiter who had delivered room service earlier, who had left behind more than just a dinner tray. In the ornate light fixture above them, a tiny camera captured everything. 3 floors down, in a room paid for with cash, Special Agent Marissa Chen watched the governor's corruption unfold in real time, her finger hovering over the raid button, waiting for the words that would seal his fate. As the midnight bells finished their toll, Pierce signed the documents. "We have a deal." The French Quarter has always kept secrets. Behind its ornate ironwork balconies and pastel facades, fortunes have been made and lost, power has changed hands, and sins have been committed and concealed for centuries. The Omni Royal Orleans Hotel, standing sentinel on the corner of St. Louis and Royal Streets since 1960, houses its own archive of whispered conspiracies and midnight dealings. But none quite as far-reaching as what transpired in Suite 412 on that February night. Blackwood gathered the signed documents with practiced efficiency, carefully tucking them into his leather briefcase. "Wise decision, Governor. The first transfers will begin next week, all above board, all properly documented." His tone was reassuring, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. "Your re-election fund will receive the initial consultation payment through the shell companies we discussed. $2 million. Clean." Pierce wandered to the window again, drawn to the glittering lights of the quarter below like a man seeking absolution. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, a phantom pressure on his chest that made each breath feel insufficient. Beneath the hotel, tourists laughed and stumbled through streets unaware of how their future safety had just been compromised, how recovery funds meant to strengthen levees and rebuild communities would now flow into offshore accounts and campaign war chests. "This stays between us," Pierce said, more to himself than to Blackwood. "Nobody else knows the full scope." Behind him, Blackwood closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "Of course. Though I should mention that Senator Hargrove is already on board for the coastal restoration portion. His committee oversight will prove flexible." He straightened his tie, already mentally moving on to his next meeting. "You're not alone in this, Governor. Many hands make the burden lighter, don't they?" The revelation hit Pierce like a physical blow. He wasn't the first official to be compromised. This wasn't a one-time deal but a systemic corruption, a cancer spreading through the state's recovery efforts. Hargrove had oversight of billions in additional funding. The scheme was larger than he'd imagined, and he was now just another node in its network. 3 floors below, Agent Chen tensed as she heard Hargrove's name. This was no longer just about a corrupt governor. They were uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the Senate. She whispered into her comm. "Did you get that? Hargrove is involved. We need to expand surveillance immediately." Her team member nodded, already making notes to request additional warrants. Back in the suite, Blackwood moved toward the door, his purpose accomplished. "We'll be in touch through the usual channels," he said, pulling on his gloves with methodical precision. "Congratulations on securing your political future, Governor. The people of Louisiana are fortunate to have leadership with such foresight." Pierce didn't respond, couldn't find words adequate to address the bitter irony. As the door closed behind Blackwood, he slumped into a chair, the enormity of his betrayal settling over him like a shroud. The jazz from Royal Street had stopped, leaving only the persistent tick of the antique clock counting down the seconds of his freedom, though he didn't yet know it. The hidden camera captured every moment of his solitude, how he buried his face in his hands, how his shoulders shook once before he composed himself, how he reached for the phone to call his wife but set it down without dialing. These quiet moments would later be dissected in courtrooms and news reports, analyzed for signs of remorse or calculation. Meanwhile, Agent Chen was already mobilizing. "We've got enough," she told her team. "But we need to track Blackwood. If he meets with Hargrove next, we want that conversation too." She pulled up satellite imagery of the quarter, marking potential exit routes from the hotel. "And get me everything we have on these shell companies. We're going to unravel this thread by thread." The night was far from over. As Blackwood's elevator descended to the lobby, as Pierce poured another drink with shaking hands, as Chen's team prepared to follow their new target through the labyrinthine streets of the French Quarter, none of them realized how this night would reshape Louisiana politics for a generation. The hurricane recovery funds, meant to heal wounds inflicted by nature, would now expose wounds of human greed far more devastating than any storm. In the morning, headlines would still celebrate Governor Pierce's recovery initiatives. Citizens would still trust their elected officials to protect them from the next disaster. But beneath that facade, the midnight meeting had set in motion a different kind of storm, one that would sweep away careers, reputations, and the public's already fragile faith in government. The storm was coming. And unlike the hurricanes that regularly threatened the Gulf Coast, no evacuation would be possible. Dawn broke over New Orleans, painting the Mississippi River in shades of orange and gold. Governor Pierce hadn't slept. He stood on the balcony of Suite 412, watching the city wake as a profound emptiness settled within him. 12 stories below, a team of FBI agents entered the Omni Royal Orleans through 3 different entrances, their movements coordinated with military precision. Agent Chen led the primary team through the lobby, flash badge already in hand. At the front desk, the night manager's eyes widened at the federal credentials. "Suite 412, Chen instructed. "Master key. Now." Her voice was quiet but brooked no argument. As the elevator climbed, she mentally reviewed the evidence: digital recordings of last night's meeting, financial records tracing the shell companies, testimony from a whistleblower inside the governor's office who'd first tipped them to the recovery fund skimming. The case was solid, but Blackwood remained the greater prize, the facilitator connecting corrupt politicians across 3 states. The elevator doors opened onto the 4th floor. Chen's team moved silently down the carpeted hallway, positioning themselves on either side of Suite 412. She raised her hand, counted down with her fingers 3, 2, 1, and then knocked firmly. "Governor Pierce? FBI. Please open the door." Inside, Pierce heard the knock like a death knell. He'd known, somehow, that this moment would come, though he hadn't expected it so soon. His legs moved mechanically, carrying him from the balcony to the door. When he opened it, he faced not only Agent Chen but the ruins of his life's work, his reputation, his freedom. "Harold Jackson Pierce, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and misappropriation of federal funds." Chen's voice was clear, professional, devoid of the disgust she felt as she recited the Miranda warnings. As agents cuffed the governor and began searching the suite, she added, "We have everything, Governor. The meeting, the documents, the offshore accounts. Cooperating now is your only play." Pierce said nothing as they escorted him through the service elevator to avoid the lobby. His mind raced through options, calculating angles, considering what he could trade. Blackwood, Hargrove, the entire network. His lawyer would argue it was a momentary lapse, a single mistake in an otherwise exemplary career. But in his heart, Pierce knew better. Last night hadn't been the beginning, it had been the culmination of small compromises that had gradually eroded his integrity like water wearing away stone. As the FBI vehicle pulled away from the hotel, morning light glinted off the handcuffs around the governor's wrists. Tourists snapped photos, not realizing they were capturing a historic moment. Across the city, simultaneous raids were underway at the offices of 3 construction companies, 2 engineering firms, and Senator Hargrove's vacation home on Lake Pontchartrain. The web was being torn apart, strand by strand. But Blackwood was already gone. His private jet had departed New Orleans International at 3:17 a.m., bound for the Cayman Islands. By the time international warrants were issued, he'd vanished into the shadowy world of false identities and jurisdictional loopholes where he operated so effectively. The spider had escaped, though his web was destroyed. That afternoon, as a stunned Louisiana watched their governor's perp walk on every news channel, the true cost of the conspiracy began to emerge. Engineering reports revealed that levee reinforcement projects had been compromised, with substandard materials used while premium-grade supplies were built. Environmental impact studies had been falsified to allow development in critical wetland buffers that protected the coast from storm surge. The very systems meant to protect the state from future disasters had been undermined by those elected to defend them. In the FBI's New Orleans field office, Agent Chin pinned photos to an evidence board: Pierce, Hargrove, Blackwood, company executives, middlemen. Red string connected them in a constellation of corruption. "We got most of them," her supervisor said, standing beside her. "That's a win." Chin shook her head, tapping Blackwood's photo. "He'll rebuild elsewhere. Different politicians, different disaster, same scheme." She turned to face her boss. "This was just one hurricane recovery fund. How many others have been hollowed out across the country? How many communities think they're protected when they're not?" 3 months later, as hurricane season approached once more, Governor Pierce accepted a plea deal, trading testimony for a reduced sentence. Senator Hargrove resigned to spend time with family before charges could be filed. Construction halted on half-finished projects throughout the coastline as contracts were reviewed. The people of Louisiana were left to wonder which protections were real and which were paper-thin facades that would crumble when the next storm surged ashore. In a crowded courtroom, Pierce finally spoke publicly about that night at the Omni Royal Orleans. "I betrayed my oath," he admitted, voice breaking. "I betrayed the people who trust us to keep them safe." His words echoed through the chamber, but for many victims of previous hurricanes, still living in FEMA trailers or struggling to rebuild, the admission came too late. Meanwhile, on a sun-drenched Caribbean island beyond extradition, Anthony Blackwood, a name that itself was merely a convenient fiction, reviewed dossiers on Mexican officials overseeing earthquake recovery funds. The governor had fallen, the senator had resigned, but the system that enabled them remained intact. As long as there were disasters, there would be federal money flowing. And where money flowed, there would always be those ready to divert the stream. Back in New Orleans, the Omni Royal Orleans continued hosting tourists and business travelers, none of whom requested Suite 412. Some claimed they could feel something wrong in that room, a heaviness, a sense of betrayal that no amount of cleaning could remove. The hotel staff dismissed such talk as superstition, but they didn't argue when guests asked to be moved to different accommodations. In time, most people forgot the details of the recovery fund scandal. New crises demanded attention, new storms threatened the coast. But Agent Chin kept Blackwood's photo on her desk, a reminder of unfinished business. Somewhere out there, the architect of corruption was starting again with new politicians, new disasters, new victims. And when he did, she would be waiting, ready to unravel his next web before more lives were caught in its threads. The storm always returns to the Gulf Coast, as inevitable as the tide. And so do those who profit from its devastation, unless someone stands guard, watchful and ready, when the waters rise again. The old corridors of Hotel Provincial breathe with history, their wood-paneled walls soaked in the memories of 2 centuries. Built in 1831, this French Quarter landmark sits on land that once housed the first military hospital in New Orleans. The original building fell during the Great Fire of 1874, and the current structure rose from those ashes, carrying forward echoes of pain and healing that seemed to linger in its very foundations. During its time as a hospital, countless soldiers drew their final breaths here, their suffering etched into the place like invisible carvings. Night in the provincial feels different from day. When darkness settles over New Orleans, the hotel's atmosphere shifts subtly. Something in the air changes, A heaviness, a watchfulness that makes even skeptics pause when walking alone down the long hallways. Guests report the sensation of being followed, of feeling a presence just beyond their peripheral vision. The staff has grown accustomed to the peculiarities, trading stories in hushed voices during shift changes, their eyes carrying the knowing look of those who've witnessed things they cannot explain. Room 233 has a particular reputation. The bed often appears rumpled when housekeeping arrives, even in unoccupied rooms. Electronic devices malfunction with unusual frequency, cameras failing to capture images, phones discharging overnight despite being plugged in. But these are mere whispers compared to what guests encounter in the main corridor connecting the hotel's two primary buildings. Here, in this transitional space between old and newer constructions, the veil between worlds seems gossamer thin. It begins with cold. Not the mechanical chill of air conditioning, but a penetrating cold that seeps into bones like winter water. Guests describe it as walking through a pocket of air that doesn't belong, as if they've stepped briefly into another season. This cold spot moves, never appearing in exactly the same place twice. Those who pass through it often report hearing something in that moment, the quick, light patter of footsteps that stop when they do, or sometimes, more disturbingly, the sound of a child's laughter. The child in the corridor has been witnessed by dozens over the years. Hotel staff keep a private log of sightings, noting patterns that emerge like constellations from scattered stars. The apparition appears most frequently between 2 and 4 a.m., that hollow time when the human mind is most vulnerable to the impossible. The figure is small, dressed in clothing from another era. Some describe a simple nightgown, others a kind of uniform. The face remains indistinct in most accounts, but the movement is always the same, a quick darting from one doorway to another, always just ahead or behind, playing an eternal game of hide and seek with the living. Margaret Stevens, night manager for 11 years, remembers her first encounter vividly. "I was doing a final walkthrough before my shift ended. The hallway was empty, then suddenly, condensation formed on the mirror at the end. I watched as small handprints appeared in the fog, 5 tiny fingers dragging downward. I couldn't move. When I finally approached, the mirror was bone dry." She paused her routine reports after that night, understanding that some experiences resist documentation. What draws this child's spirit to the corridor rather than to a specific room? Paranormal investigators suggest that transitional spaces, hallways, stairwells, doorways, often attract spectral energy. They represent liminal territory, either here nor there, much like the state between life and death itself. The corridor at the Provincial sits atop what would have been the children's ward of the military hospital, where young patients, sons and daughters of soldiers, victims of the epidemics that regularly swept through New Orleans, often perished from typhoid, yellow fever, and other maladies that medicine of the time could not conquer. Yet questions linger like morning mist. Why does this particular spirit remain when others have passed on? What unfinished business keeps a child tethered to a hotel corridor, playing an endless game with unsuspecting guests? The answers may lie buried in old hospital records or perhaps in the very foundation stones of the building itself. If only we could hear what they've witnessed through the long, quiet nights of 2 centuries. Despite these unsettling encounters, the Provincial remains a beloved landmark. Guests return year after year, some specifically hoping for their own brush with the otherworldly. The management maintains a respectful stance toward their spectral residents, neither exploiting nor denying their presence. In a city where the line between life and death has always been celebrated rather than feared, the child in the corridor is simply another thread in the rich tapestry of New Orleans lore. Tracy Montgomery came to the Provincial as a skeptic. A journalist working on a series about haunted hotels, she arrived with an arsenal of recording equipment and a mind firmly closed against the possibility of genuine spectral phenomena. "I've debunked 12 supposedly haunted locations," she told the front desk clerk with barely concealed amusement. "I'm just here to get the facts straight." The clerk merely smiled and handed her the key to room 231, directly across from the famous corridor. For 3 nights, Tracy documented temperature readings, electromagnetic fluctuations, and audio recordings, finding nothing beyond the ordinary creaks and settling sounds common to any old building. She wrote in her journal each evening, filling pages with rational explanations and psychological theories about mass delusion and the power of suggestion. On the third night, sleep-deprived and frustrated by the lack of material for her article, she decided to spend the entire night in the corridor itself. The hotel had grown quiet by 1 a.m. The revelers from Bourbon Street retired to their rooms or passed out elsewhere. Tracy set up a small camp chair in the middle of the hallway, equipped with her digital recorder, an infrared camera, and a thermos of coffee. Hours passed in stillness. The coffee grew cold. Her eyelids grew heavy. Just before 3:30 a.m., as her head nodded towards sleep, the temperature around her plummeted. The sudden cold jolted her awake, her breath clouding in front of her face like smoke signals in the dim, emergency lighting. Then came the sound, not footsteps or laughter, but something more intimate and heartbreaking, the sound of a child crying. Not loudly, but with the muffled quality of someone trying desperately not to be heard. Tracy froze, her journalist's instinct temporarily overridden by primal fear. The crying seemed to circle her, impossible to pinpoint. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice smaller than intended. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The crying stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, Tracy felt watched, evaluated by something she couldn't see. A small hand touched her shoulder, light as a butterfly, cold as December rain. Tracy didn't scream. Something in the touch communicated such profound loneliness that her fear dissolved into compassion. When she slowly turned, she caught just a glimpse, a small figure at the end of the hallway, partially transparent like an image projected on smoke, watching her with eyes that reflected centuries of waiting. Then it was gone, leaving only a lingering scent of camphor and herbs, reminiscent of old-fashioned medicine. Tracy never published her planned exposé. Instead, she wrote a thoughtful piece about the thin boundaries between worlds, about how grief and trauma might imprint themselves on physical spaces. She couldn't prove what she'd experienced, as her equipment had failed at precisely the crucial moment. The camera battery drained, the audio recorder filled with static. But she knew what she had felt, a connection across time with someone who needed acknowledgement more than investigation. Hotel Provincial's management received Tracy's article with quiet appreciation. They neither confirmed nor denied her experience but added her account to their private collection. Paranormal research groups requested permission to conduct investigations, which the hotel limited to respect both guests and whatever presence might reside in their historic halls. The child in the corridor became something of a protective spirit in staff lore, mischievous at times, but never malevolent. Recent renovations proceeded with unusual care. Construction crews reported tools moving overnight, blueprint pages turned to reveal historic designs no one had consulted. The project manager, initially frustrated by these disruptions, began leaving small tokens in the corridor: a vintage toy soldier, a handmade doll, a bag of old-fashioned candy, which remained undisturbed but somehow looked slightly used the following morning. Work progressed smoothly after that, as if they'd received unspoken approval. While most hotels would silence rumors of haunting for fear of driving away customers, the Provincial embraces its spiritual dimensions. Not as a gimmick or attraction, but as an acknowledgement that history lives alongside us in ways we may never fully comprehend. Each night, as the last guests retire and the corridors empty, someone on staff whispers a simple goodnight to the empty air. And sometimes, if they listen carefully in the moments after, they might hear the faintest response, not in words, but in the subtle shifting of the air, like a child turning over in sleep, finally at peace in the only home they've ever known. What keeps a spirit tethered to a place long after their physical form has gone? Paranormal researchers suggest powerful emotional attachments, trauma, unfinished business, or simply love. The child in the corridor seems to exist in a loop of eternal seeking, forever looking for something, or someone, who vanished long ago. Perhaps it's a parent lost in war, a sibling separated by death, or a caretaker from the hospital days who showed kindness when little else did. The hallway itself may serve as a boundary the spirit cannot cross, a liminal space that holds them between worlds. The most compelling theory emerged from hospital archives discovered during the hotel's most recent renovation. Water damage had revealed a false wall in the basement, behind which lay a collection of medical records dating back to 1862. Among them, the case of 80-year-old Charlotte Winters, daughter of a Union officer, admitted with pneumonia while her father recovered from battle wounds in another ward. The records note her habit of sneaking from her bed at night to visit her father, navigating the very corridor that now witnesses the child's apparition. Staff documented her increasing distress when prevented from these visits. Charlotte's father died unexpectedly from infection. The records indicate the child was not immediately told, her own condition being precarious. She continued her nightly attempts to reach him, growing weaker each day. The final entry notes her passing 3 weeks after her father's, still calling for him in her delirium. The hospital chaplain wrote a poignant addendum. "Child died without comfort of knowing father waited for her. May they find each other in God's kingdom where no corridors separate loving hearts." Could this be our corridor child, forever seeking a reunion that never happened in life? The time frame matches. The location aligns perfectly with known sightings. Even the described behaviors, the searching, the appearing and disappearing, the interaction primarily with adult guests rather than children, suggest a child looking for a parental figure. But the theory, compelling as it is, doesn't explain everything. Multiple witnesses describe a male child, not a girl. Others report 2 children at once, holding hands before vanishing into solid walls. Perhaps the provincial hosts not one spirit but many. The hospital would have seen countless children pass through its wards during epidemics that regularly devastated New Orleans. Yellow fever alone claimed thousands of young lives throughout the 19th century. The hotel stands as both monument and memorial to suffering that modern medicine has largely relegated to history books. Each little footstep echoing in the night might belong to a different child, their stories overlapping like ripples in the same dark pond. What remains consistent across all accounts is the feeling witnesses describe afterward, not terror or revulsion, but a profound sadness tinged with unexpected tenderness. Many report an overwhelming urge to offer comfort, to speak words of reassurance to empty air. Some leave small offerings, a toy, a flower, a piece of candy, which frequently disappear overnight. The provincial has become a place of unexpected connection between the living and whatever remains after life ends, a bridge across the ultimate divide. For those who've encountered the child in the corridor, the experience often changes something fundamental in their understanding of existence. Tracy Montgomery, the once skeptical journalist, now leads specialized historical tours of New Orleans that focus on sites of spiritual significance. "I don't claim to understand what happens when we die," she tells her groups. "But I know the provincial showed me that our connections to each other don't simply terminate when breathing stops. Whatever remains, energy, consciousness, soul, it continues to reach out across the divide." As night falls over the French Quarter, Hotel Provincial settles into its evening rhythm. Guests return from dinners and shows, corridors briefly bustling with life before gradually quieting. The old building creaks and sighs, its wooden bones expanding and contracting with the cooling air. A father rushes to the ice machine, glancing nervously down the famous hallway. A couple returns late from Bourbon Street, laughing too loudly, falling silent as they pass through an unexpected pocket of cold air. And somewhere in the spaces between moments, a child waits, watches, and wonders about the strangers passing through their eternal playground. Perhaps tonight someone new will feel that gentle touch, hear that muffled crying, or catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of vision. Perhaps they'll experience that strange communion that happens when the wall between worlds momentarily thins. In the morning, they may question their experience, or rationalize it away, but something will remain with them, some quiet certainty that the hotel's long hallways contain more than just air and history. The child in the corridor continues their eternal vigil, reminding us that some journeys never truly end, and some travelers never reach their final destination. The air inside Le Pavillon hung thick with anticipation as 6 strangers found themselves stranded in the once vibrant restaurant space. Outside, the New Orleans storm had reached a crescendo, unleashing a torrent that transformed streets into rivers and severed power lines across the city. The grand French windows that normally showcased the garden district's charm now displayed only a canvas of relentless gray, punctuated by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the ornate dining room. Martha clutched her cashmere cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her wedding ring catching the dim emergency lights. "The doors won't budge," she announced, returning from the third attempt at the main entrance. "The electronic locks have completely shut down." Her voice carried no panic, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to taking charge of unexpected situations. Across the room, Daniel peered through the kitchen doorway, his chef's whites still pristine despite the hours of service before the power had failed. The 6 patrons had been his last customers before the storm intensified, and now his responsibility extended beyond culinary satisfaction. The restaurant's backup generators had kicked in, but only powered the emergency lighting and refrigeration units, leaving the electronic security system in lockdown mode, a safety feature that now trapped them all inside. "We've got food and water," Daniel offered, his French accent thickening under stress. "But cell service is completely dead, and the landlines too." He placed a bottle of aged Bordeaux on the nearest table and began uncorking it with practiced efficiency. "Perhaps we should introduce ourselves properly. It seems we may be here for some time." The wine flowed as the storm raged, creating an unlikely communion among the stranded. Eliza, a visiting archaeology professor, pressed her glasses higher on her nose while explaining her research at nearby excavation sites. Her animated hands painted pictures of forgotten histories buried beneath the Louisiana soil, momentarily distracting everyone from their predicament. Next to her sat Marcus, a jazz musician whose callous fingertips tapped an unconscious rhythm on the tablecloth. His eyes kept drifting to the vintage piano in the corner, as if calculating whether playing might soothe or agitate the group's collective nerves. The storm's cadence provided an unpredictable percussion against the windows, challenging even his improvisational instincts. "I should be on a flight to Boston right now," remarked Sophia, twisting her corporate ID badge between manicured fingers. Her tailored business suit seemed increasingly out of place as the hours stretched on. "There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow that apparently can't proceed without me." The irony of her current emergency hung unspoken in the air. The oldest among them, Gerald, had remained silent until now, nursing his bourbon more than drinking it. "This place used to be a private residence, you know," he finally offered, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Back in the 1890s. Belonged to the Devereux family." He gazed around at the converted mansion's architectural details with knowing eyes. "They say the daughter of the house never left, even after death." The group's collective tension changed character at the mention of a ghost, shifting from frustration at their circumstances to a prickling awareness of the building around them. The candles Daniel had retrieved from the storage room cast elongated shadows across the intricately carved moldings and darkened doorways, creating corners of mystery where before there had only been elegant design. A sudden crash from the kitchen shattered the momentary quiet. The group startled as one body, wine sloshing in glasses. Daniel rose first, hesitating at the threshold between dining room and darkness beyond. "Probably just a pan falling," he offered weakly. But when he failed to move toward the sound, the 6th member of their impromptu gathering stood. "I'll check," said the man who had introduced himself simply as Thomas. His weathered face revealed nothing as he disappeared into the kitchen's shadows. The remaining 5 exchanged glances, some concerned, others curious, united by one unsettling question that hung in the air like the storm's humidity. What exactly had they learned about Thomas during their introductions? And why could none of them quite remember? The minutes stretched painfully as they waited for his return. When Thomas finally emerged, his expression had changed subtly, like a painting viewed in different light. "Nothing there," he announced, sliding back into his seat. "But I found something else entirely." From his pocket, he withdrew an aged brass key, its elaborate design reminiscent of another century. This was hanging on a hook by the back door, labeled attic. In the silence that followed, the storm seemed to pause its assault, as if the weather itself was listening to what might come next. Martha's eyes fixed on the key, her practical demeanor momentarily overtaken by unmistakable recognition. That's impossible, she whispered. That key shouldn't exist anymore. 5 puzzled expressions turned toward her, but before she could explain, the emergency lights flickered once, twice, and then extinguished completely, plunging Le Pavillon into absolute darkness. The blackness enveloped them like velvet, impenetrable and immediate. Someone gasped, Sophia perhaps, while chairs scraped against hardwood as people instinctively rose to their feet. Everyone stay calm, Daniel's voice commanded through the darkness. A match struck, its sulphury scent cutting through the lingering aroma of food and wine. The small flame illuminated his face from below, transforming his features into something almost sinister before he lit the nearest candle. Golden light slowly reclaimed portions of the room as Daniel moved methodically from candle to candle. With each new point of light, the faces of the stranded diners emerged from shadow, their expressions caught between relief and deepening unease. The storm's ferocity had intensified, water now seeping beneath the front door to form a creeping line across the antique floorboards. The generator must have failed completely, Daniel explained, setting the final candle on the piano. The flame's reflection danced in the polished ebony surface, conjuring phantom fingers on keys. The refrigeration systems are down now too. We should move perishables to the ice boxes before everything spoils. Martha hadn't taken her eyes off Thomas, who still held the attic key between his fingers like a talisman. Where exactly did you find that? She asked, her voice now stripped of its earlier authority. I need to know precisely. Thomas tilted his head, studying her with newfound interest. You recognize it? Not a question, but a confirmation. How fascinating. I found it exactly where I said, by the kitchen's rear exit. The question is, how do you know about a key in a restaurant you've supposedly never visited before tonight? The accusation hung between them. Gerald's bourbon glass clinked as he set it down with deliberate care. Perhaps we should all share a bit more about ourselves, the old man suggested. Starting with why certain coincidences seem to be gathering in this room like storm clouds. Marcus abandoned his chair and moved toward the piano, no longer able to resist its pull. Mind if I play something? Might help us think. Without waiting for permission, his fingers found the keys, producing a delicate melody that seemed to float above the storm's chaos. A Chopin nocturne, melancholy and searching. As the music filled the candlelit space, Eliza moved to the windows, pressing her palm against the cold glass. The water level outside is rising, she observed quietly. We may need to move to the upper floors if this continues. She turned back to the group, her academic detachment momentarily fractured by genuine concern. That attic might become more than just a curiosity. Sophia abandoned her corporate persona entirely, kicking off her heels and helping Daniel collect fallen silverware from beneath a table. My grandmother used to tell stories about this place, she confessed. I didn't make the connection when I made my reservation. She claimed her great-aunt attended a dinner party here in 1923 that ended. Strangely. Strangely how? Thomas prompted, still rolling the ornate key between his fingers. Several guests went missing after exploring the attic, Sophia replied, her voice barely audible above the piano and storm. They were never found, but their belongings started appearing around the city over the following years. A watch in a garden 2 blocks away, a necklace in a church collection plate, a ring in a riverbed. The piano music faltered as Marcus processed this information, his improvisation taking a discordant turn before recovering into something more tense and questioning. The candles flickered as if in response, shadows lengthening across the antique wallpaper where faded patterns began to resemble figures in motion when viewed from the corner of one's eye. I think, Gerald said slowly, draining his bourbon, that we should establish some ground rules for our unexpected stay. First and foremost, no one ventures anywhere alone, especially not to investigate unexplained noises. His weathered gaze settled on Thomas. And perhaps that key should remain exactly where you found it. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes as he pocketed the key again. Too late for that, I'm afraid. Besides, aren't you all curious what's up there? This storm isn't ending anytime soon, and we've exhausted all small talk. He gestured broadly at the group. We have an archaeologist, A businessman, a musician, a chef, an apparent key expert, and myself, a writer collecting unusual stories. If that isn't a perfect cast for an exploration, what is? Martha took a step forward, her earlier composure entirely shattered. You're not a writer, she said, her voice shaking. I know exactly who you are, Thomas Devereux. At the name, Gerald's head snapped up in recognition, and even the skeptical Eliza turned from the window with widened eyes. Before Thomas could respond, a door slammed somewhere deep within the restaurant, not the kitchen this time, but farther away, perhaps upstairs. The candle flames bent horizontally, as if a sudden current of air had swept through the sealed building. The piano lid crashed down, narrowly missing Marcus's fingers as he leapt back with a startled oath. Eliza pointed toward the main staircase, her academic reserve completely abandoned. There's someone up there, she whispered. I saw movement on the landing. In the silence that followed her declaration, they all heard it distinctly, the sound of footsteps crossing the ceiling above them, moving with deliberate slowness toward the center of the building, directly over their heads. Dust drifted down from the ornate chandelier, catching in the candlelight like falling stars. Thomas stood, his face transformed by an expression of triumph rather than fear. It seems, he said quietly, that we're no longer alone in Le Pavillon, and I believe an introduction is long overdue. He withdrew the attic key from his pocket once more, holding it up so that it caught the candlelight. Shall we go meet our host? The chimes of slot machines filled the air, a synthetic symphony that had become as familiar to Theo Grady as his own heartbeat. For 43 years, the Royal Sonesta Casino had been his second home. No, his true home. The worn velvet of his regular seat at blackjack table 7 carried the impression of his body, like a faithful dog's bed might hold its master's scent. Theo's weathered hands, veined and spotted with age, shuffled his chips with the practiced precision of a concert pianist. At 72, he had outlasted 3 casino owners, 6 marriages, and countless gambling systems that promised fortunes but delivered only emptiness. Never miss a Tuesday, he would tell anyone who would listen. His ritual was sacred: arrive at 7 p.m. sharp, order a neat whiskey, and play until the desert sun cracked the horizon. The dealers knew him by name, knew how he sipped his drink after every fifth hand, knew the way he tapped the green felt twice before making a large bet. Some pitied him, others admired his consistency in a world built on chance. Tonight, though, something felt different. The cards seemed to hesitate before revealing themselves, the dice appeared to hang in the air a millisecond longer. Even the cocktail waitresses gave him longer glances than usual. Theo sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a tension thick as cigar smoke. Was it the weather? The casino had always been a climate-controlled bubble, insulated from the Nevada heat and the passage of time itself. Yet tonight the air felt charged, electric with possibility. He had come with $8,000, his monthly gambling budget, meticulously saved from his postal service pension and social security checks. Theo never touched his savings. That was the one rule he never broke. The money represented 43 years of calculated losses, the price tag for his addiction to hope. What most people couldn't understand was that Theo wasn't playing to win anymore. He played because the casino was the only place where he felt truly alive. The first few hours passed with the predictable ebb and flow of small wins and larger losses. By midnight, Theo was down $3,000, a typical trajectory for his Tuesday sessions. The pit boss, Miguel, nodded at him from across the floor, their silent ritual of acknowledgement. Miguel had started as a dealer 20 years ago. Now he oversaw the entire pit, but still kept a watchful eye on the casino's oldest regular customer. What Miguel couldn't know was that tonight's session felt like a farewell tour to Theo. Something deep in his bones told him this might be his last dance with Lady Luck. Not because he was quitting, gamblers like him never truly quit, but because of the letter from his doctor that now sat folded in his breast pocket, its message burning against his chest like a hot coal. Stage 4. 6 months at best. The irony wasn't lost on him. A lifetime of gambling, and his final odds had nothing to do with cards or dice. Theo ordered another whiskey and gestured to the dealer for fresh cards. The young man, Jenkins, according to his name tag, offered a sympathetic smile. Jenkins was new, probably didn't know Theo's history or habits yet. Didn't know about the time in '89 when Theo had won $70,000 only to lose it back over the next 3 days. Or about his 1995 collapse at the craps table, his heart failing temporarily before the paramedics revived him, only for him to return to the same table 5 days later, against medical advice. The cards slid across the felt, glossy under the hanging lights that never dimmed, in this palace where time stood still. Theo looked at his hand, a jack and a 9. 19, a strong hand. The dealer showed a 10. The smart play was to stand, statistical wisdom built on centuries of mathematical probability. But tonight wasn't about playing smart. Tonight was about feeling that magnificent rush one more time, that heart-bursting sensation that had replaced love, family, and normal life decades ago. Against all logic, against the screaming mathematics in his head, against the subtle wince from the dealer who knew better, Theo tapped the table. "Hit me." The Royal Sinesta had seen millions of cards dealt, billions in chips exchange hands, thousands of dreams shattered and fulfilled. Yet few moments carried the weight of this one seemingly insignificant decision from an elderly man at a half-emptied blackjack table in the early morning hours of a Wednesday in June. The dealer's hand moved toward the shoe, preparing to draw the card that would determine far more than just the outcome of a $20 bet. The card slid across the green felt with finality a deuce. 21 exactly. Theo's expression remained unchanged, though his heart raced with a dangerous fervor. The dealer paid him $40. A small victory, but in that moment, Theo felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine surprise. The gambler's equivalent of a lightning strike. This unexpected turn initiated a streak unlike any he'd experienced before. Over the next 3 hours, Theo's chips multiplied like cells in a petri dish. 5,000 became 10, then 20, then 50. A small crowd gathered as word spread about the old-timers' run. Dealers rotated, but Theo remained fixed, a human monument to persistence. His usual stoic demeanor cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the young man who'd first walked into the Royal Sinesta 4 decades earlier, full of dreams and devoid of the calluses that gambling inevitably forms on the soul. Miguel approached carefully, like one might approach a rare natural phenomenon that could dissipate if disturbed. "Mr. Grady, would you like to take a break? Perhaps some food?" The concern in his voice was genuine. Epic winning streaks could be as dangerous as losing ones for regulars like Theo. "I'm fine, Miguel," Theo replied, his voice steady despite the $87,000 in chips stacked before him. "Just fine." By dawn, the impossible had happened. Theo had amassed $212,000. Cell phone cameras captured his final hand, another blackjack prompting applause from the assembled onlookers. Some were tourists who'd stumbled upon the spectacle, others were casino employees who'd seen thousands of gamblers come and go, but never witnessed a run quite like this. The casino manager personally escorted Theo to the cashier, then to his modest sedan in the parking lot. "That was quite a night, Mr. Grady. Will we see you next Tuesday?" Theo smiled cryptically as he placed his winnings in the trunk. "Perhaps," was all he said. But as he drove home through the awakening Las Vegas morning, past billboards promising easy riches and architectural monuments to statistical impossibility, Theo knew he wouldn't return. Not next Tuesday. Not ever. The gambling gods had granted him one final victory lap, a proper goodbye to the addiction that had simultaneously ruined and defined his life. At home, Theo made 2 phone calls. The first to his estranged daughter in Seattle, whom he hadn't spoken to in 12 years. The second to a travel agency. Then he carefully divided his winnings into 3 precise stacks. The first, and largest, went into an envelope addressed to his daughter. The second he allocated for the journey he'd always promised himself but never taken, a world cruise departing from San Francisco in 3 days. The third portion he kept liquid, enough to ensure comfort in whatever time remained. The letter from his doctor seemed lighter now as he removed it from his pocket and placed it on his cluttered desk. The diagnosis hadn't changed, but something else had. For the first time since his youth, Theo felt unburdened by the compulsion that had controlled his every decision. The universe had granted him one perfect night, one statistical anomaly, one moment of grace. Outside his window, Las Vegas shimmered in the morning heat, a mirage of opportunity that had held him captive for nearly 5 decades. The city's siren call had finally gone silent for Theo. He packed methodically, taking only what he needed, leaving behind the accumulated evidence of a life dedicated to chance. His lucky shirt, his gambling ledgers, the system notebooks filled with meticulous calculations that had never quite worked all remained behind. The taxi arrived precisely at noon. As Theo locked his apartment door for the final time, he experienced a sensation that had eluded him throughout his gambling career, the feeling of walking away at exactly the right moment. The Royal Sonesta would continue without him, its machines chiming, cards shuffling, dice tumbling. New gamblers would take his place, seeking the elusive high that comes with betting against probability. His phone buzzed with a message from his daughter. "Dad, I got your voicemail." "Yes, I'll meet you in San Francisco." 6 simple words that meant more than all the chips he'd ever won or lost. As the taxi pulled away, Theo didn't look back at the apartment building that had been his address but never his home. The horizon before him, for the first time in decades, held something more valuable than the next hand, the next roll, the next spin. It held possibility unconstrained by odds, uncalculated by systems, ungoverned by the house edge that had defined his existence. The eternal gambler had played his final hand, and for once, he was taking his winnings with him. The greatest gamble still lay ahead, reconnecting with his daughter, seeing the world through eyes unclouded by addiction, making peace with his mortality. These were bets with no calculable odds, no systems to guide him. And somehow, that made them the most thrilling wagers of all. The taxi merged onto the highway, away from the glittering strip that had been his North Star. Theo Grady closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades lift from his shoulders. The doctor had given him 6 months. But freed from the gravitational pull of the Royal Sonesta, those 6 months stretched before him like an eternity of possibilities. In the end, the eternal gambler had beaten the house not by winning money, but by walking away with something far more precious, the remainder of his life, finally his own to spend as he chose. The honeygold light of a New Orleans sunset spilled across the cobblestone courtyard of the Dauphine Orleans Hotel, casting long shadows that seemed to reach like fingers toward the infamous May Bailey's Place. Once the city's most notorious bordello, now it served as the hotel's bar, quietly preserving secrets from the city's colorful past. Among these secrets, none was more compelling than the tragic tale of a young bride whose spirit was said to haunt the Honeymoon suite, her presence as enduring as the Spanish moss that draped the courtyard's ancient oak. Sarah and Michael Donovan stood in that same courtyard, luggage at their feet, faces upturned toward the wrought-iron balconies of their honeymoon destination. The travel-weary couple had driven 14 hours from Chicago, chasing a dream of jazz, beignet, and the unique magic that pulsed through New Orleans' historic streets. Their modest wedding budget hadn't allowed for extravagance, but when Sarah discovered a last-minute cancellation at the Dauphine Orleans, a room that normally booked months in advance, she jumped at the opportunity, ignoring the slight chill that ran down her spine when the reservation agent mentioned it was the honeymoon suite. "Mrs. Donovan, your chariot awaits," Michael teased, lifting their suitcases as the bellhop ushered them through the lobby's grand entrance. The hotel's interior breathed history from every polished banister and crystal chandelier, a live-in elegance that whispered of genteel gatherings and secrets kept behind closed doors. The bellhop, an older man named Raymond whose family had worked at the Dauphine for 3 generations, maintained a professional smile, but his eyes darted nervously toward the stairs leading to the upper floors. Had the newlyweds been less absorbed in each other, they might have noticed his hesitation, the way his hands trembled slightly as he pressed the antique key into Sarah's palm. "Room 403, Raymond announced, his voice carrying an undercurrent of tension like a hidden current beneath still waters. "One of our most Requested accommodations. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully before continuing. The suite dates back to the 1850s, when part of this building served as residence for some of the city's more affluent personalities. What Raymond didn't mention was the suite's most famous occupant, a young woman named Millie who, in 1857, had prepared for her wedding night in that very room. According to hotel lore, Millie had waited in her white lace gown for a groom who never arrived. Overwhelmed by shame and heartbreak, she had ended her life before morning light, her blood staining the original floorboards that still lay beneath the modern carpeting. The honeymoon suite greeted the Donovans with unexpected coolness despite the sultry September heat outside. High ceilings and tall windows overlooked the courtyard, while period furniture, a four-poster bed, vanity table, and writing desk, created a sense of stepping backward through time. Sarah ran her fingers over the vanity's polished surface, admiring the craftsmanship, while Michael tipped Raymond and closed the door behind him. "Can you believe this place?" Sarah breathed, twirling in the center of the room where afternoon light caught dust motes dancing in the air. "It's perfect." Michael crossed to her, sliding his arms around her waist. "Not as perfect as you," he murmured against her hair, breathless with the realization that this talented, beautiful woman was now his wife. Neither noticed the mirror's reflection shifting slightly, capturing not just their embrace but a third figure, a pale face watching from the darkened corner with hollow eyes that held both longing and resentment. As twilight deepened into night, the Dauphine Orleans transformed around them. Gas lamps that had been converted to electric still cast the same intimate glow that had illuminated countless whispered conversations and stolen kisses across centuries. The couple returned from dinner on Bourbon Street, cheeks flushed from champagne and the warm evening air, ready to begin their honeymoon proper. But something in the room had changed during their absence, a heaviness that pressed against their skin, a scent of lilies and copper that neither could quite place. The first undeniable sign came just before midnight, when Sarah emerged from the bathroom to find every drawer in the room open, her wedding dress removed from the closet and carefully arranged across the bed as if awaiting a body. Michael stood frozen by the window, confusion etched across his features. "Did you do this?" he asked, voice tight with uncertainty. Sarah shook her head slowly, a cold weight settling in her stomach. The wedding dress seemed to gleam in the low light, its white satin almost luminous against the crimson bedspread that suddenly looked far too much like spilled blood. The night stretched before them, pregnant with possibility and dread. Neither wanted to acknowledge the growing certainty that in the historic honeymoon suite of the Dauphine Orleans, they were not alone. Beyond the window, New Orleans continued its nightly revelry, oblivious to the century-old tragedy preparing to unfold once more within those elegant, haunted walls. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of room 403, illuminating the disheveled state of the honeymoon suite. Sarah sat rigid at the vanity, her reflection pale and drawn after a night of unexplained disturbances, cold spots that moved like living entities, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and the persistent smell of lilies that strengthened and faded like breath. Michael stood at the window, watching the courtyard below where tourists gathered for the hotel's famous breakfast, blissfully unaware of what transpired in the room above. "We should leave," Michael suggested, his voice taut with exhaustion and mounting anxiety. "We can find another hotel. New Orleans has thousands of rooms." But Sarah remained oddly still, transfixed by something beyond her reflection in the antique mirror. "She's in pain," she whispered, her fingers tracing patterns on the vanity's wooden surface as if following invisible writing. "She's been waiting so long for him to return." The night had transformed Sarah. What began as a series of easily dismissed coincidences, a misplaced hairbrush, fluctuating room temperature, had escalated to undeniable phenomena that left Michael questioning his own rationality. At 3 a.m, they both watched, paralyzed, as the bathroom door slammed shut despite no breeze, followed by the sound of heartbroken sobbing that seemed to echo from every corner at once. "This isn't a joke anymore, Sarah. You're scaring me." Michael approached his wife cautiously, noticing how her skin had taken on an alabaster quality that reminded him uncomfortably of antique porcelain dolls, beautiful but lifeless. When he touched her shoulder, the coldness of her skin shocked him like an electric current. "Jesus, you're freezing." Sarah turned to face him, but her eyes seemed to focus somewhere beyond, as if viewing a different time layered over their reality. "Her name was Millie," she said softly. "Raymond told me while you were getting the luggage from the car. She was waiting for her wedding night, but her fiancé was killed in a duel that morning. No one told her until she'd spent hours waiting in her gown, slowly realizing he wouldn't come." A photograph on the nightstand caught Michael's attention, their wedding photo that he'd placed there last night. The glass now bore a spiderweb of cracks, radiating outward from Sarah's smiling face. The cracks reminded him of tears, like the photograph was weeping for something lost. Down in the lobby, Raymond polished glasses behind the bar, preparing for the day's first customers. His weathered hands moved mechanically while his mind drifted upward to room 403. He'd seen that particular look in Sarah Donovan's eyes before, a certain susceptibility that Millie's spirit seemed drawn to. Not everyone could sense the residual energy that clung to the honeymoon suite like smoke, but those who could often became entangled in ways that defied explanation. The hotel manager approached, coffee in hand. "The newlyweds still up there?" he asked casually, though the tension around his eyes betrayed his concern. Raymond nodded, setting down the glass he'd been polishing for several minutes. "The wife has the look. You know the one." Both men exchanged knowing glances, recalling previous incidents. The bride who'd cut her hair into an 1850s style overnight, the woman who'd been found sleepwalking in the courtyard in her nightgown, calling for someone named Thomas. The Dauphine Orleans generally managed its supernatural reputation with careful marketing, parlaying ghost stories into a selling point for adventure-seeking tourists. But Millie was different, less a benign presence than a wound that refused to heal, occasionally reopening to draw others into her century-old grief. Upstairs, Sarah stood abruptly, moving toward the closet with the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker. She withdrew her wedding dress again, holding it against herself as tears streamed down her face. "She just wants one night," Sarah whispered. "One perfect night that was stolen from her." Michael backed toward the door, torn between concern for his wife and growing terror. The room temperature had plummeted to the point where his breath fogged in front of him, while the mirror now showed not just Sarah but the translucent outline of another woman standing behind her, hands resting possessively on Sarah's shoulders. The spirit's face bore an unsettling resemblance to Sarah's, same heart-shaped face, same delicate features, as if Millie had been searching for a physical match to temporarily inhabit. "Sarah, listen to me," Michael pleaded, fighting against the supernatural current that seemed to be pulling his wife away. "Whatever you're feeling, it's not yours. It's her pain, her loss, not yours." His words struck against an invisible barrier, and Sarah's only response was a sad smile that didn't belong to her. The wedding dress rustled as Sarah moved toward the bathroom, her movements no longer her own. The door closed behind her with a decisive click that echoed through the room like a final judgment. Michael lunged forward, rattling the suddenly locked handle as panic surged through him like wildfire. "Sarah," his fists pounded against the solid oak door as water began to run on the other side. The sound of it filling the antique clawfoot tub created a backdrop for a melody Sarah had begun to hum, a lilting, antiquated wedding march that raised goosebumps along Michael's arms. Through the keyhole, he caught a glimpse of his wife submerging her wedding dress in the rising water, her face serene and distant as if preparing for a ceremony only she could see. In that moment, Michael realized that the true horror of the Dauphine Orleans honeymoon suite wasn't just the presence of a ghost. It was the ghost's ability to make the living yearn for the peace of joining her. As he raced down the hallway to find help, the hotel seemed to close around him like a living entity, corridors stretching impossibly long while doors remained stubbornly shut against his desperate calls. Behind him in room 403, two brides separated by more than a century prepared for a wedding night that would never come, bound together by heartbreak that transcended death itself. The Dauphine Orleans added another chapter to its ghostly ledger, while outside, the eternal city of New Orleans continued its dance between past and present, the veil between worlds thin as gossamer, and just as easily torn. Raymond was already halfway up the stairs when Michael came barreling down the hallway, the older man's face grim with resignation and foreknowledge. In his hand he clutched a small leather pouch, grisgris, the protective magic of New Orleans voodoo practitioners. This wasn't the first time Millie had attempted to claim a bride, nor would it be the last, but Raymond carried generations of knowledge passed down through his family, defenders against the darker currents that ran beneath the city's festive surface. "She's in the bathroom," Michael gasped, leaning against the wall as Raymond produced the skeleton key from his pocket. The key slid into the lock with practiced ease, as if the door recognized an old adversary. Together they entered the honeymoon suite, now transformed by Millie's presence. The mirrors reflected not the modern room but a vision of the same space from 1857, gas lamps instead of electric lights, different furnishings arranged according to long-forgotten fashions. The bathroom door stood open now, steam billowing out to fill the suite with humid, lily-scented air. Inside, Sarah sat submerged in the clawfoot tub, fully clothed in her soaking wedding dress, her eyes closed and face peaceful as if sleeping. "Not again," Raymond murmured, moving with surprising speed for his age. He pulled the stopper from the tub while Michael lifted his unresponsive wife from the water, her weight surprisingly light, as if something essential had already departed. Her skin remained cold despite the hot water, her pulse thread-thin beneath Michael's desperate fingers. Raymond worked quickly, opening the leather pouch to sprinkle salt and herbs in a circle around them, muttering words in Creole French that seemed to thicken the air. "This happens sometimes," he explained between incantations. "Millie finds those who resemble her, whose happiness reminds her of what she lost. She doesn't mean harm, she just wants to borrow their joy, feel alive again through them." As if summoned by her name, a figure materialized at the bathroom doorway, a young woman in an antiquated wedding gown, her form transparent but growing more solid with each passing second. Her eyes, fixed on Sarah with hungry intensity, held the desperate loneliness of one who had waited in vain for over a century. "This one isn't for you, Millie," Raymond said firmly, his voice taking on an authority that seemed to resonate through the walls themselves. "She has her own path, her own love. You must find your peace another way." Michael cradled Sarah's limp form, whispering her name like a prayer against her wet hair. "Come back to me," he pleaded, tears falling freely. "Whatever she's showing you, whatever she's promised, it's not real. This is real. Us. Here." The spectral bride wavered, her form flickering like a candle flame in wind as Raymond continued his ritual. The hotel's hidden energies seemed to converge in the room, not just Millie but echoes of other lives, other stories that had played out within these walls. The Dauphine Orleans wasn't just a building but a repository of emotions too powerful to fade, preserved in its very foundation like insects in amber. Sarah gasped suddenly, her body convulsing as if breaking through a surface, eyes flying open with shocked recognition. "Michael?" Her voice cracked, gaze darting around the room in confusion. "What happened? I was somewhere else." She was so sad, so alone. Behind them, Millie's apparition began to dissolve, not with anger but with a resignation that suggested this was merely an intermission, not the final act. Her eyes met Sarah's one last time, a silent communication between women separated by death but connected by empathy, before she faded completely, leaving only the faintest scent of lilies hanging in the air. Raymond slumped against the wall, energy depleted from the ritual. "She'll be back," he warned quietly. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but Millie never truly leaves. The Dauphine Orleans is her home, her prison, her eternal wedding venue." Later, as they packed their belongings with shaking hands, Michael noticed Sarah's lingering glances at the mirror, searching for something, or someone, no longer visible. "What did you see?" he finally asked. "When she had you?" Sarah paused, wedding dress dripping on the bathroom floor where they'd left it to be dealt with later. "I saw her life," she answered, voice distant. "How she waited, how she slowly realized he would never come. And then..." She trailed off, fingers absently touching her throat. "She just wanted to feel loved, even for a moment." Outside their window, New Orleans continued its eternal celebration of life, music floating up from street performers in Jackson Square. The city that proudly claimed to be America's most haunted embraced its ghosts as part of its identity, the dead and living coexisting in uneasy balance. The Dauphine Orleans Hotel would continue welcoming guests, its brochures hinting at supernatural encounters as an added attraction rather than a warning. Michael and Sarah Donovan would return home with a story they'd never fully share, marked by an encounter with grief so powerful it had survived death itself. And in room 403, the honeymoon suite would be cleaned, refreshed, and rented again, the staff carefully selecting which guests would occupy it, preferably not newlyweds, not women who resembled a long-dead bride named Millie. The ghostly legacy of the Dauphine Orleans honeymoon suite would persist, a tragic love story without resolution, waiting for the next visitor vulnerable enough to feel the weight of a heartbreak that had transcended a century and showed no signs of releasing its hold on the thin boundary between this world and whatever waits beyond. The Lafayette Guest House stands like a sentinel of history amid the tumult of New Orleans' French Quarter, its brick facade weathered by centuries of Gulf storms and human drama. Built in 1849, the three-story structure bears witness to the city's ever-changing fortunes, from antebellum prosperity to post-Katrina resilience. Room 21, situated at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor, carries a particular weight of tragedy that seems to seep from its walls like rising damp. The key to this room turns with unusual resistance, as if the lock itself hesitates to reveal what lies beyond. The story begins in the sweltering August of 1908, when a young woman named Emily Brennan arrived at Lafitte's with a single leather suitcase and eyes that, according to the desk clerk's journal, seemed to have already seen too much of life's cruelties. Her signature in the guest registry reveals a delicate, educated hand, the penmanship of someone raised with privilege but traveling under strain. What brought her to New Orleans remains clouded in historical ambiguity, though newspaper archives suggest she may have been fleeing an arranged marriage in Savannah. Emily requested room 21 specifically, though no record explains this preference. The room overlooked a small courtyard, where jasmine vines climbed wrought-iron trellises and a fountain burbled day and night. That evening, as summer lightning illuminated the quarter in brief, electric flashes, Emily drew a bath. The clawfoot tub, still present in the room today, filled slowly with water that witnesses later described as unnaturally cold, despite the season's blistering heat. What happened in the following hours has become a tapestry of fact and speculation, its threads tightly woven through the hotel's subsequent century. Staff reported hearing singing from room 21, a haunting melody that drifted down the corridor like morning mist over the Mississippi. The night manager noted in his log that the voice sounded joyful then mournful, as if the singer couldn't decide which emotion to embrace. No one disturbed her, following the hotel's policy of guest privacy. But when Emily failed to appear the following morning, and knocks went unanswered by afternoon, the hotel owner used his master key to enter the room. The scene they discovered transformed Lafitte's guest house forever. Emily lay submerged in the bathtub, her long dark hair swirling around her face like aquatic plants anchoring her to this world. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling in what one maid described as peaceful surprise. No signs of struggle disrupted the room's careful arrangement. Her clothes hung neatly in the armoire. Her journal lay open on the nightstand, its last entry a cryptic line. "The water calls louder than he ever did." The coroner ruled the death an accidental drowning, perhaps facilitated by laudanum found in her toiletry case. Yet questions bubbled to the surface immediately. How had the bathwater remained so cold in August heat? Why did 3 witnesses report seeing a man leaving the room near dawn, though hotel records showed no visitor? Most puzzling, why did Emily's skin bear no signs of prolonged immersion, appearing instead just briefly kissed by water, when evidence suggested she had been submerged for hours? The mystery deepened when they drained the bathtub. Beneath Emily's body, they discovered a gold pocket watch with an inscription. "Until time stops, JL." The initials launched a century of speculation. Some believed they referred to Jean Lafitte himself, the infamous pirate whose treasure allegedly remained hidden throughout the city. Others connected them to James Levine, a wealthy cotton broker who had reportedly broken an engagement with a young woman matching Emily's description. Within months, the first reports of strange occurrences in room 21 began. Guests complained of inexplicable cold spots, particularly in the bathroom. Some awoke to find the tub filled with several inches of water, though they had not drawn a bath. Others reported dreams of drowning, so vivid they gasped awake, sheets soaked with sweat that felt, mysteriously, cold to the touch. A photograph taken in 1912 shows what appears to be a woman's figure reflected in the room's mirror, though no woman was present when the image was captured. For the hotel owners, Emily's presence became something between burden and bizarre attraction. They knew some guests specifically requested room 21, drawn by macabre curiosity. Others fled in the middle of the night, leaving belongings behind rather than spend another hour in what one guest in 1925 described as a room where the air itself feels like it's drowning. What had once been a death became something more entangled with the hotel's identity, a haunting that breathed alongside its living inhabitants, neither fully departed nor completely present. The legend might have faded like so many New Orleans ghost stories if not for what happened in 1933, 25 years after Emily's death. A journalist from the Times-Picayune named Martin Chambers stayed in room 21 while researching an article on French Quarter hauntings. Skeptical by profession, Chambers approached the assignment with detached amusement. He later wrote that he chose the room to prove that ghost stories, like good bourbon, improve with age but have no substance beyond the thrill they provide. His plans unraveled on his third night. Awakened by what he described as a woman's cold fingers tracing patterns on my chest, Chambers opened his eyes to find the room suffused with an unnatural blue glow. The bathroom door stood open though he had closed it before sleeping. Inside, the tub had filled completely, water gently sloshing over its porcelain edges. Rising from this impossible pool was a figure, not precisely Emily as photographs showed her, but something attempting to approximate her form. Like memory struggling to reconstruct a beloved face, Chambers wrote. The apparition spoke no words but held out a dripping hand beckoning. Chambers, by his own admission, found himself moving toward her. Not through fear but a sudden, overwhelming sorrow that seemed to flow from her into the room. He stopped at the bathroom threshold, gripping the door frame. The figure's face changed then, from invitation to rage, from beauty to something Chambers could only describe as brief turned monstrous. The water in the tub rose impossibly, defying physics, spiraling upward around the female form like a waterspout in miniature. Chambers fled the room, soaked to his skin though he never entered the bathroom. When staff checked room 21 the following morning, they found the bathroom bone dry, without a drop of spilled water. But carved into the mirror's surface, visible only when fogged by steam, were the words, "Not an accident." The hotel closed room 21 for renovation after Chambers' experience, reopening it months later with a new bathtub and fixtures. The original clawfoot tub was moved to storage in the basement, where multiple employees refused to go after reporting the sound of water dripping within the empty vessel. Eventually, the hotel's owner insisted on returning the original tub to room 21, claiming guests complained the room didn't feel right without it. Upon its reinstallation, the strange occurrences resumed with renewed intensity. Throughout the following decades, Emily's presence in room 21 seemed to ebb and flow like the tides. The 1940s and early 1950s saw few reported incidents, as if the spirit had retreated into the building's bones. But in 1957, something changed. A French Quarter psychic named Madame Verreau, known for her parlor seances that attracted wealthy tourists, visited Lafitte's guest house with a warning. Someone has disturbed her rest. She's angry now, and anger in the dead is dangerous for the living. The catalyst for this disturbance came to light when renovations revealed a hidden space behind the bathroom wall. Inside, workers discovered a man's monogrammed handkerchief, yellowed letters bound with faded ribbon, and a small glass vial containing traces of what toxicology tests later identified as arsenic. The monogram matched the pocket watch's inscription, "Jail." Most telling was a hotel receipt dated the night of Emily's death, showing a James Levine had indeed visited the hotel, though his name appeared nowhere in the guest registry. These discoveries transformed Emily's drowning from tragic accident to likely murder, though separated by half a century from justice. The items were photographed for historical record but disappeared from the hotel's safe days later. That same week, 3 guests in room 21 reported waking to find themselves partially submerged in bathwater they hadn't drawn, the liquid tinge faintly red, as if mixed with blood. Hotel management considered closing room 21 permanently after these incidents, but financial concerns prevailed. Instead, they hired a Catholic priest to bless the room and a Voda priestess to perform cleansing rituals. For a time, the atmosphere lightened. Guests reported pleasant dreams rather than nightmares, and some even described feeling watched over rather than haunted. One woman in 1962 claimed to have seen a young lady in old-fashioned dress, who smiled sadly before vanishing, the first account of Emily appearing outside the bathroom. This piece proved temporary. As New Orleans entered the tourism boom of the late 20th century, Room 21's notoriety spread through guidebooks and walking tours. Visitors began leaving offerings for Emily, flowers, jewelry, handwritten notes, believing interaction might trigger a ghostly encounter. The room became a paranormal tourist attraction, with guests hoping for the very experiences that had terrified their predecessors. Emily seemed to respond to this attention with increasing physicality. In 1978, a honeymooning couple captured an audio recording of a woman weeping, the sound transforming into what sound analysts described as underwater screams. A photographer in 1985 developed film showing a female figure standing behind him in the bathroom mirror, her eyes replaced by dark, empty sockets that appeared to leak black tears down her cheeks. Most disturbing was the 1994 incident when a skeptical university professor woke to find his arms covered in bruises shaped like fingerprints, each mark surrounded by a ring of frost despite the room's warmth. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 marked another turning point in Room 21's haunted history. When floodwaters receded from the quarter, the hotel's basement revealed its secrets. The rising water had disturbed long-settled sediment, exposing a small tin box containing a daguerreotype of Emily Brennan alongside a man whose face had been scratched out of the image. More telling was a letter in the same handwriting as Emily's journal, addressed to "My dearest sister," and dated one day before her death. Its contents revealed Emily had discovered her lover's betrayal. He was already married and had been slowly poisoning her to prevent scandal. The letter ended prophetically. "If something happens to me, do not believe it an accident or my own doing. He has taken enough from me in life. I refuse to let him claim my death as well." This evidence renewed interest in Emily's case. Paranormal researchers flocked to Lafitte's guest house, equipment in tow, eager to contact the spirit of a woman whose story had evolved from suicide to murder victim to vengeful ghost. What they captured changed the nature of Room 21's haunting, because for the first time, their recordings contained not just Emily's presence, but a male voice as well, whispering words that chilled even the most hardened investigators. She was supposed to stay beneath the water. The year was 1914, and New Orleans was a city of contradictions, a place where elegance and decay walked hand in hand through streets steeped in history. At 727 Toulouse Street stood the Hotel Maison Delawareville, a structure whose Creole architecture and wrought-iron balconies whispered stories from another century. Within its walls, Dr. Joseph Lambert had maintained his medical practice for nearly 3 decades, treating the wealthy and the destitute with equal dedication. The doctor's office, located in what is now Suite 9, had witnessed countless tales of suffering, healing, and occasionally death. But none would haunt its walls like the story of Angelique Dubois, the doctor's last patient. Dr. Lambert was a man of science in an age still clinging to superstition. His weathered face, framed by a neatly trimmed white beard, had begun to show the weight of years spent battling disease and human frailty. His eyes, once bright with youthful optimism, now carried the muted light of someone who had seen too much suffering. Yet his hands remained steady, instruments of precision that had saved countless lives in a time when medicine was as much art as science. He moved through his office with deliberate steps, each movement reflecting the methodical approach that had defined his career. It was a stifling August evening when Angelique arrived at his door. The air hung heavy like a sodden blanket, and the usual sounds of the French Quarter seemed muffled by the oppressive heat. Angelique was barely 20, with skin the color of polished amber, and eyes that held secrets beyond her years. She came from a prominent Creole family whose fortunes had dwindled after the Civil War, leaving them with little but their proud name and crumbling ancestral home. The girl's symptoms were puzzling: fever that came and went like an indecisive ghost, unexplained bruising that bloomed across her skin like midnight flowers, and most disturbing, dreams of a shadowy figure who visited her each night, whispering promises of eternal devotion. What Dr. Lambert could not know as he welcomed the young woman into his office was that her illness would become his final medical mystery, one that would end with both their names etched into the hotel's shadowy folklore. Angelique's case defied conventional diagnosis. Her blood tests revealed nothing unusual, yet her condition deteriorated with alarming speed. Within weeks, her once vibrant form had withered, leaving her as fragile as autumn leaves awaiting winter's first frost. As September yielded to October, Dr. Lambert's concern deepened. He had begun keeping Angelique in an adjoining room overnight for observation, his scientific mind refusing to surrender to the whispers of voodoo and supernatural influence that had begun circulating among the hotel staff. But even he could not ignore the strange occurrences: windows that opened against the wind, objects that shifted position without explanation, and the persistent scent of jasmine that seemed to follow the girl despite the season. The most unsettling incident occurred on the 13th night of her stay. A maid reported hearing animated conversation from the patient's room well past midnight, though Angelique had been alone when the doctor checked on her before retiring. When questioned the next morning, the girl smiled with uncharacteristic serenity and said only, "He came to me again. He says soon we'll be together forever." Her eyes, usually clouded with pain, shone with an inner light that chilled the doctor more than any symptom he had yet observed. Dr. Lambert documented everything with scientific precision, his journal entries betraying growing frustration and, increasingly, fear. His final entry, dated October 28, 1914, ended with words that would later seem prophetic. "I fear I am no longer treating just a patient, but fighting against something I cannot name, a force that seems determined to claim her. And perhaps, in some way I cannot yet comprehend, me as well." The following morning, the hotel staff discovered both doctor and patient dead in Suite 9. Their bodies lay side by side, untouched by violence, their expressions eerily peaceful. Angelique's hand rested lightly on the doctor's arm, as though she had been guiding him somewhere in their final moments. Morning sunlight crept through the windows of Suite 9, illuminating dust particles that danced like miniature spirits above the bodies of Dr. Lambert and Angelique. The hotel manager, a practical man usually immune to the superstitious whispers that floated through New Orleans like Spanish moss, found himself crossing himself instinctively before approaching the scene. The room felt wrong, not with the expected heaviness of death, but with a peculiar lightness, as though the air itself had been cleansed of something substantial. The temperature dropped noticeably near the bodies, despite the warmth of the October morning outside. News of the deaths spread through the French Quarter with supernatural speed. By noon, theories abounded, from poison to suicide pact to more sinister explanations involving spirits and unfinished business. The coroner, a longtime colleague of Dr. Lambert, found no medical explanation for the simultaneous deaths. Both bodies showed signs of rapid deterioration inconsistent with their conditions the previous day, as though something fundamental had been extracted from them overnight. Most disturbing were their expressions, a serenity that spoke not of surrender to death, but of willing passage into something beyond. The meticulous case notes Dr. Lambert had kept offered tantalizing but incomplete clues. In entries dating back weeks, he described Angelique's claims of nightly visitations by a man she called Henri, a figure she insisted had loved her in another time. Initially dismissing these as fever dreams, the doctor's later entries suggest growing uncertainty. A. Described Henry's clothing in detail today, a style I recognize from portraits of the 1840s, She could not have seen such specific elements in books or local museums. And later, found speaking rapid Creole French in her sleep, a dialect she claims not to know when awake. The phrases are archaic, consistent with mid-19th century usage. Perhaps most telling was a passage written 3 days before their deaths. I dreamed of Henri myself last night. He stood at the foot of my bed, wearing the exact clothing described. He spoke to me not as a threat but as one physician to another, claiming he had diagnosed what I could not, that A's soul was bound to his, and that time had finally aligned for their reunion. I woke convinced I had merely incorporated A's stories into my own dreams, yet I found a single jasmine flower on my bedside table. The windows were locked. My door was bolted from within. The investigation into the deaths continued for months without resolution. The room was eventually reclaimed, refurbished, and rented to new guests. Yet Suite 9 quickly developed a reputation among hotel staff. Housekeepers reported finding jasmine flowers inexplicably appearing on pillows. Guests complained of sudden cold spots and whispered conversations that ceased when they entered the room. Several reported dreams of a young Creole woman and an elderly gentleman who seemed to be guiding them somewhere, only to disappear upon waking. By the 1920s, the Hotel Maison de Ville had embraced its ghostly reputation, like many establishments in the supernaturally inclined city. Suite 9 became particularly sought after by those interested in paranormal experiences. One guest, a medium from Boston, claimed to have made contact with Dr. Lambert in 1925. According to her account, the doctor explained that he and Angelique had not died but transitioned together. I finally understood her condition, the medium quoted Lambert as saying. Her soul was split between 2 times, gradually being pulled away. I followed to document the process scientifically, but found myself unable to return. What began as local ghost story eventually attracted the attention of paranormal researchers. In 1967, a team from Duke University's parapsychology department spent 2 weeks in Suite 9. Their equipment recorded dramatic temperature fluctuations and unexplained electromagnetic anomalies. More intriguingly, audio recordings captured fragments of what sounded like a clinical discussion between a male voice and a female voice with a French accent. When analyzed, the conversation appeared to be describing the symptoms of spiritual displacement across time, a condition not recognized by any medical literature. Most compelling was the testimony of Dr. Eleanor Marsh, the team's lead researcher and a skeptic by nature. On the final night of their stay, she reported waking to find Dr. Lambert sitting in a chair beside her bed, his appearance exactly matching historical photographs. Rather than fear, she described feeling an overwhelming sense of professional curiosity from him. He wasn't haunting the room, she later wrote. He was still conducting research, still trying to understand what had happened. He seemed pleased to have another doctor to observe his findings. Today, Suite 9 remains one of the most requested rooms at the Hotel Maison de Ville. Guests report experiences ranging from peaceful dreams to full apparition sightings. The most consistent phenomenon involves the smell of jasmine followed by a sudden clarity of thought or unexpected solution to a problem. Some have speculated that Dr. Lambert continues his healing work from beyond, while others believe he and Angelique serve as guides for souls caught between worlds, like doctors in a metaphysical emergency room. Perhaps most poignant are the journals occasionally found with entries not made by their owners, precise, clinically worded observations about the hotel guests, signed with the initials JL. These entries often contain insights about the guests' undiagnosed physical or emotional conditions, frequently proven accurate upon later medical consultation. The doctor, it seems, is still in. The most recent documented encounter occurred during the hotel's renovation in 2015. A contractor working alone in Suite 9 reported feeling a hand on his shoulder as he removed part of the original wall. Behind the plaster, he discovered a small tin box containing a leather-bound journal and a pressed jasmine flower preserved between its pages. The journal belonged to Dr. Lambert, with entries continuing well beyond his recorded date of death. The final page, dated 1957, contained just 3 lines. After 43 years of observation, I can confirm that death is not an ending but a transition. The barrier between worlds is permeable to those who understand its nature. Angelique was right all along. Researchers approached the Lambert phenomenon from different angles, some treating it as a classic residual haunting, others as evidence of quantum consciousness survival. Historians point to the doctor's unique position at the crossroads of Creole folk medicine and modern scientific practice, suggesting he may have inadvertently discovered principles that unified both worlds. Skeptics maintain that the hotel simply perpetuates the legend for commercial purposes, manufacturing evidence to satisfy ghost-hunting tourists. Yet those who have spent significant time in Suite 9 often leave with a common impression, not of a place haunted by trapped spirits, but of a doorway deliberately kept open by a physician who found his greatest medical discovery at the moment of his supposed death. They describe not the cold dread typically associated with hauntings, but a clinical curiosity that feels distinctly human, as though they've temporarily become subjects in an ongoing study conducted from just beyond perception's edge. Perhaps the true story of Dr. Lambert and his last patient isn't about death at all, but about a different kind of healing, one that reaches across the ultimate boundary to remind us that consciousness, like energy, may change forms but never truly disappears. In a city where the veil between worlds has always seemed as delicate as morning mist over the Mississippi, the doctor's final case continues, each new guest another data point in his eternal research into medicine's final frontier. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, where the old world charm melds with 1,000 whispered tales, stands the Andrew Jackson Hotel. Its elegant Georgian facade belies the darkness within its walls, a darkness that traces back to the early 19th century when the property served a different purpose. Before the hotel's grand pillars and sweeping balconies graced the corner of Royal Street, a courthouse and jail occupied this hallowed ground. Here, Judge Pierre Martinet earned his grim moniker, the Hanging Judge, for his merciless sentencing of criminals to the gallows. His reputation for swift, uncompromising justice casts a long shadow that stretches across 2 centuries, persisting in the creaking floorboards and cool drafts that sweep through the hotel's corridors without warning. The year was 1814, and New Orleans teetered on the precipice of change. The Louisiana Purchase had brought American rule to this French colonial outpost just over a decade earlier, creating tensions that simmered beneath the surface of polite society. Judge Martinet, appointed to bring order to this transformative period, took to his task with frightening zeal. A photograph of the judge reveals a stern-faced man with deep-set eyes that seem to pierce through time itself, a gaze cold as January rain and twice as unforgiving. Historical accounts paint him as a man who ruled his courtroom like a fiefdom, the sharp crack of his gavel falling like an executioner's axe. Through the yellow fever epidemics and street violence that plagued the Crescent City, Martinet's brand of justice never wavered. He sentenced men to death with such frequency that locals began to avoid walking past the courthouse, not wishing to hear the desperate pleas that echoed from its windows or witness another body swinging from the gallows in the courtyard behind. But fate has a way of balancing scales that even the strictest judge cannot control. During a particularly humid summer evening in 1824, as storms gathered over the Mississippi, Martinet was found dead at his bench, his face frozen in an expression of apparent terror. The official cause was recorded as a sudden apoplexy, but whispers circulated that something more sinister, perhaps even supernatural, had occurred. The courthouse eventually crumbled, replaced by newer structures that themselves gave way to the current hotel, named for the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Yet something of Judge Martinet remained, as if his severe spirit had seeped into the foundation stones. Hotel staff have collected accounts spanning generations, stories of a tall, gaunt figure seen gliding through the halls after midnight, wearing antique judicial robes. Guests report waking to the sensation of being watched by someone standing at the foot of their beds, only to find an empty room filled with air inexplicably cold for the New Orleans climate. Some claim to hear the distinct sound of a gavel striking wood in vacant rooms, followed by a voice pronouncing sentences on unseen defendants. One particularly chilling account comes from Maria Laveau, a descendant of the famous voodoo queen who worked as a housekeeper at the hotel in the 1970s. While cleaning room 208, she felt an unseen presence push her with such force that she stumbled against the wall. When she turned, no one was there, but the mirror had fogged over as though someone had breathed upon it. As she watched in frozen fascination, a single word appeared in the condensation: guilty. Maria resigned that afternoon, refusing to ever set foot in the building again. The management dismissed her story as the imaginative fears of a superstitious woman, but they couldn't explain the strange marks found on her back, 5 long bruises resembling fingerprints from an unusually large hand. What makes these haunting tales particularly compelling is their consistency. The temperature drops, the sense of judgment, the manifestation of a stern presence. These elements appear in accounts separated by decades, told by witnesses who could have had no knowledge of previous incidents. The Andrew Jackson Hotel has become a magnet for paranormal investigators and ghost tour groups, all seeking evidence of the hanging judge's enduring presence. Yet, for all their electromagnetic field detectors and spirit boxes, the most convincing evidence comes from the spontaneous experiences of unsuspecting guests who know nothing of the hotel's shadowy past until they feel the cold breath of judgment on their necks. The most documented incidents center around room 208, where maintenance staff refused to work alone after dark. Legend holds that this space roughly corresponds to where Martinet's bench once stood in the old courthouse. Here, electronic devices malfunction with unusual frequency. Lights flicker without electrical explanation. Guests report dreams of trials where they stand accused of forgotten crimes, waking with the echo of a gavel still ringing in their ears. One couple from Minnesota checked out at 3 a.m., leaving behind most of their belongings in their haste to escape what they described as the weight of someone's disapproval that made it impossible to breathe normally in the room. Former night manager Thomas Blackwell kept a detailed log of unusual occurrences during his tenure from 1998 to 2003. His meticulous records reveal a pattern of inexplicable phenomena that intensified around the anniversary of Martinet's death each July. The hotel seems to remember, he wrote in his final entry before resigning. The walls hold memories that have nothing to do with paint or plaster. Something moves through these rooms that cannot be explained away by settling foundations or French Quarter revelry outside. Judge Martinet never left his courthouse. He just waits here, passing judgment still. Paranormal researcher Dr. Eleanor Tate conducted a series of overnight investigations at the Andrew Jackson Hotel between 2010 and 2012. Her team captured unexplainable cold spots that moved like sentient beings throughout the building, temperature drops of 15 degrees that would materialize and vanish within seconds. Audio recordings revealed faint, rhythmic tapping reminiscent of a gavel striking wood, while infrared cameras occasionally detected a tall, stationary figure in empty hallways. When replayed at different speeds, some recordings seemed to contain a voice pronouncing judgments in archaic legal language reminiscent of early 19th century court proceedings. The findings were compelling enough for Dr. Tate to conclude that the hotel contained what she termed impression haunting, the emotional residue of Judge Martinet's judicial severity imprinted upon the physical space. Perhaps most disturbing were the experiences reported by psychically sensitive visitors who knew nothing of the hotel's history. Medium Claire Dennison visited in 2015, ostensibly as a regular guest. Within hours of arrival, without prompting, she approached the manager asking about the judge who never stopped working. She described feeling overwhelming sensations of scrutiny and assessment, as though every action she took was being weighed against some unknowable standard. "He's still here," she said, "still deciding who deserves punishment and who merits mercy. But mostly punishment. His scales never balanced in life, and they don't in death." The hotel management has alternated between capitalizing on these stories and attempting to distance themselves from the more frightening aspects. Current owner Marcus Dupree acknowledges the reports but maintains a diplomatic stance. "We're part of New Orleans history, and history isn't always comfortable. Judge Martinet was a real historical figure who worked where our hotel now stands. Whether his spirit remains is something each guest must decide for themselves." This measured response hasn't stopped the Andrew Jackson Hotel from appearing on virtually every ghost tour route in the French Quarter, with guides pointing dramatically toward its windows as they recount tales of the judge's ghostly gaveling. What separates the hanging judge from many ghost stories is the weight of historical authenticity behind it. Court records confirm Martinet's reputation for harsh sentences. Architectural plans show the current hotel built directly atop the foundations of the old courthouse. The convergence of documented history with consistent supernatural claims creates a narrative too compelling to dismiss entirely. Even skeptics find themselves speaking in hushed tones when passing through the hotel's lobby after dark, their rational minds acknowledging the power of suggestion while something more primitive responds to the unexplainable chill that sometimes descends like an invisible fog. Some visitors seek out the hotel precisely for these experiences, booking room 208 months in advance and bringing equipment to document their own encounters with the judge. Others find themselves unwitting participants in his continuing court, waking from troubled sleep with the unshakable feeling they've been found wanting by some ancient, implacable authority. The Andrew Jackson Hotel continues its double existence, a charming historic accommodation by day, and by night, the domain of a judge whose final gavel never fell. Every creaking floorboard might be his approaching footstep, every cold draft, his scrutinizing presence, every shadow in the corner, his robed figure preparing to deliver a verdict from which there can be no appeal. Those who work at the hotel develop their own relationships with its spectral resident. Housekeeping supervisor Elena Fuentes has created her own ritual after 15 years on staff, a small greeting when she enters rooms associated with paranormal activity, an acknowledgement of the judge's continued presence. "I just say, 'Good morning, Judge,' and go about my business," she explains. "I figure if he's still here after all this time, he deserves the respect of his title, at least." She claims this small courtesy has spared her the experiences that have sent other staff members fleeing in terror, though she admits to occasionally finding items moved from where she placed them, as if someone had been inspecting her work. Night security guard Walter Johnson tells of patrols through silent corridors where the temperature suddenly plummets, his breath fogging in the chill while the summer heat blazes just outside the windows. "You get used to it," he shrugs, though his eyes betray the unease that never quite fades. "Sometimes I hear him moving around upstairs when all the guests are accounted for. Footsteps too heavy to be anyone staying here, too purposeful to be random creaks. He's still making his rounds, making sure justice is served even if there's no one left to sentence." The most recent documented incident occurred in April 2022, when a guest, a criminal defense attorney from Chicago, awoke screaming in room 208, claiming he had been put on trial in his dreams by a severe man in old-fashioned robes who knew every case he had ever lost, every guilty client he had helped set free. The attorney checked out immediately, visibly shaken. 3 days later, a legal ethics complaint was filed against him in Illinois, eventually leading to his disbarment for violations that had gone undetected for years. Coincidence, perhaps, but those familiar with Judge Martinet's lingering presence suggest his sense of justice extends beyond gentle hauntings to a more direct influence on those he deems deserving of punishment. As dusk settles over the French Quarter each evening and tourists stroll past the Andrew Jackson Hotel's illuminated facade, few recognize they are passing the invisible boundary of a court still in session after 2 centuries. Inside those elegant walls, beneath chandeliers that cast more shadows than light in certain angles, the hanging judge continues his eternal deliberations. His presence remains as divisive in death as his judgments were in life, feared by some, dismissed by others, but impossible to completely ignore in the midnight hours when the hotel grows quiet and something that sounds almost like a gavel breaks the silence. In those moments, guests and staff alike might wonder if they stand accused in his spectral courtroom, and what sentence awaits when dawn finally arrives. The saxophone's mournful wail cut through the New Orleans night. Antoine Dumarquet closed his eyes, feeling the notes pour from his soul as the audience at Hotel St. Marie fell silent. For 60 years, his music had been the heartbeat of the French Quarter, but tonight's performance carried a secret weight. The doctors had given him 3 months, lung cancer stage 4. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very breath that powered his lifelong passion was now failing him. His fingers, though gnarled with arthritis, moved with practiced precision across the brass keys as he concluded his signature piece. "By you moonlight." The final note hung in the air, suspended like a confession, before dissolving into thunderous applause. Nobody in the crowd suspected this might be his last public performance. Antoine had told no one of his diagnosis, not even his granddaughter Amelia, who watched from the bar, pride shining in her eyes. She'd inherited his musical gift but chose classical piano over jazz, a decision that had once created distance between them. That rift had healed over time, like an old melody finding its harmony after years of dissonance. The Hotel Saint Marie had been Antoine's second home since 1962, when he'd first arrived from rural Louisiana with nothing but his saxophone and determination. The ornate chandelier lights reflected off his instrument as he took a bow, his thin frame casting a disproportionately grand shadow against the vintage wallpaper. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight." He spoke softly into the microphone, his voice raspy from decades of smoky clubs. "I've played 1,000 stages, but none feels like home the way this room does." The crowd's response washed over him like a warm tide. What they couldn't know was that Antoine had made a decision. His final performance would be a private one, played from the balcony of room 412, the same room where he'd spent his first night in New Orleans. He'd already made arrangements with the hotel manager, an old friend who'd reluctantly agreed to his unusual request. After the show, well-wishers surrounded him, their faces blurring together after decades of similar nights. But Antoine's mind was elsewhere, mentally cataloging the music he would play on his final night, pieces that had marked the milestones of his life. He caught Amelia's eye across the room and motioned for her to join him. There was so much he needed to tell her, so many stories that would die with him if he didn't share them now. The weight of unspoken words pressed on his chest more heavily than the tumor growing inside it. The hotel had changed hands multiple times over the decades, but somehow the Art Deco fixtures and creaking floorboards remained, preserving the soul of the place like artifacts in amber. Antoine ran his hand along the polished wood of the bar as Amelia approached. How many celebrations had this bar witnessed? How many heartbreaks had it absorbed? The bartender, Lamar, placed Antoine's usual, whiskey neat, before him without being asked. Some rhythms never changed, even as the musicians who created them grew old. "You were magnificent tonight, Grandpa," Amelia said, embracing him. At 32, she looked remarkably like her grandmother Marie, Antoine's wife who had passed 7 years earlier. The same determined chin, the same knowing eyes that seemed to see through pretense. Antoine took a sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn as it traveled down his throat. He wondered, not for the first time, if a lifetime of this particular indulgence had contributed to his condition. But regret was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I have something important to tell you," he began, his voice nearly lost in the ambient chatter of the hotel lounge. But before he could continue, dizziness overcame him. The room tilted like a ship in rough seas, glasses and faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of color and light. The last thing Antoine saw before darkness claimed him was Amelia's expression shifting from joy to terror. His final thought wasn't of fear, but of music, the unplayed melodies that might die with him, notes scattered into silence like ashes in the wind. The hospital lights seemed unnecessarily harsh to Antoine when he awoke. Clinical fluorescence had replaced the warm glow of the hotel street. Marie, and the rhythmic beeping of machines substituted for the jazz that usually filled his ears. Amelia sat beside his bed, her face drawn with concern and something else, knowledge. The doctor had told her everything. Antoine could see it in the way she looked at him, with that terrible mixture of love and pity that he'd been dreading. Her hand squeezed his, a lifeline in the sterile ocean of the hospital room. 3 months, he confirmed before she could ask. Maybe less now. His saxophone case sat in the corner of the room, brought by someone who understood that separating Antoine from his instrument was like severing a limb. The case looked forlorn against the institutional green walls, a relic from another world. "I didn't want anyone to know. Especially not you." "Why?" Amelia's voice broke on the single word. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the window like soft percussion. Even nature, it seemed, provided accompaniment to life's most difficult conversations. Antoine struggled to sit up, feeling the weakness in his body, a stranger's body, not the one that had once danced until dawn and played sets that lasted until morning light spilled through club windows. Because knowing changes things, he said simply. People look at you differently. They start saying goodbye before you're gone. I wanted to leave the stage with dignity, not carried out on a wave of sympathy. He thought of the hotel room awaiting him, of his planned farewell, a private concert for the ghosts of his past and the city that had embraced him. Now that secret too had been compromised. Amelia wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood that Antoine's heart ached. The doctor says you can leave tomorrow, but you need rest. No performances. Her words carried the weight of medical authority, but Antoine heard the unspoken question, what happens now? The future, once a road stretching endlessly forward, had become a rapidly shortening path disappearing into fog. I have one more performance in me, Antoine said, his voice finding strength in defiance. Not for an audience. For me. For New Orleans. He described his plan for room 412, watching as understanding dawned on Amelia's face. She didn't argue as he expected. Instead, she nodded slowly, recognition passing between them, the understanding that artists complete their lives as they've lived them, through their craft. The doctor might dictate the medical facts of Antoine's remaining days, but only Antoine could decide how those days would be spent. As night deepened outside the hospital window, they began to plan his final concert, note by note, memory by memory. The rain continued its steady rhythm, as if keeping time for a song only they could hear. In that moment, Antoine felt a curious peace settle over him. Death might be waiting in the wings, but for now, the music played on. 2 weeks later, Antoine stood on the wrought-iron balcony of room 412 at the Hotel St. Marie, saxophone in hand. The evening air hung heavy with humidity, carrying the mingled scents of magnolia, fried seafood, and the distinctive petrichor of rain-washed streets. Below, the French Quarter pulsed with its eternal rhythm, tourists wandering with plastic cups of hurricane cocktails, street performers working their corners, locals navigating the familiar chaos with practiced ease. None of them knew that above their heads, a legend was preparing for his true final performance. The hotel room behind him had been arranged according to his specifications. No flowers, no fuss, just a comfortable chair facing the balcony, a bottle of Sazerac rye whiskey, and a vintage record player borrowed from the hotel's lobby. The walls of room 412 had witnessed decades of his visits, from the night he'd first arrived in New Orleans to celebratory stays after major performances. If these walls could speak, they'd tell his story better than any biography. Antoine ran his fingers over the saxophone's keys, feeling the familiar indentations worn by years of playing. Amelia had helped him check in, fussing over him with a mixture of reverence and concern that Antoine both appreciated and found mildly irritating. She'd wanted to stay, but he'd insisted on being alone. Some journeys, even musical ones, were meant to be solitary. She'd left reluctantly, making him promise to call if he needed anything, both of them knowing the deeper meaning behind her words. Now, as twilight transformed the city into a canvas of purple shadows and amber lights, Antoine lifted the saxophone to his lips. His first selection was St. James Infirmary, a nod to the inevitable. The mournful melody floated out over the quarter, blending with the ambient sounds of the city like a single thread weaving into a complex tapestry. He played without sheet music, the notes emerging from muscle memory and emotional truth. Passers-by on the street below occasionally glanced up, their faces momentarily transformed by the unexpected beauty descending from above. A few stopped to listen, their hurried pace surrendering to the music's insistence on being heard. As one song flowed into the next, Antoine felt himself detaching from physical discomfort. The weight in his chest, the constant companion of pain that had become his shadow, receded beneath the tide of music. He moved through his personal canon, pieces that marked his journey from a shy country boy to a respected master of his craft. Each note felt like turning a page in a well-loved book, revealing stories still vivid despite their age. The quarter moon rose higher, casting silver light across the cityscape and transforming rooftops into islands in an urban sea. Between songs, Antoine sipped whiskey, letting the liquor warm him from within. The medication bottle in his pocket remained untouched. He decided that tonight would be about clarity, not the fog of painkillers. His granddaughter had argued against this choice, but some decisions weren't negotiable. The next piece he played was an original composition, Marie's Waltz, written for his late wife. As he breathed life into the melody, Antoine could almost feel her presence beside him, her perfume mingling with the night air. The saxophone became a vessel for conversations they could no longer have, for apologies and affirmations too long delayed. What surprised Antoine was how physically demanding the performance became. Each breath required more effort than the last, his lungs fighting against their own deterioration. Yet there was a curious liberation in this struggle, a final battle that seemed fitting for a life dedicated to transforming breath into art. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the evening breeze, and his fingers began to tremble slightly between phrases. Still, he continued, each completed song a small victory against the advancing darkness. As midnight approached, Antoine knew he was nearing the end of his strength. He'd saved his most personal composition for last. Farewell to Bourbon Street, a piece he'd been working on secretly since his diagnosis. The melody contained fragments of every significant musical influence in his life, from the gospel songs of his childhood church to the avant-garde experimentations of his middle years. It was biography as music, legacy distilled into sound. As he played the final phrases, Antoine closed his eyes, surrendering completely to the moment. The final note lingered in the air like a question left unanswered or a door left slightly ajar. Antoine lowered the saxophone slowly, suddenly aware of the small crowd that had gathered on the street below. Their applause drifted up to him, soft at first, then swelling like a wave. He offered a small bow, his silhouette framed against the warm light spilling from the hotel room behind him. Among the upturned faces, he spotted Amelia, who had disobeyed his wishes to be alone. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that silent exchange passed understanding deeper than words could express. Antoine Dumarquet stepped back from the balcony rail, carefully placed his saxophone in its case, and sat heavily in the waiting chair. The night air caressed his face, carrying with it the eternal sounds of the city he loved. He had given New Orleans everything, his youth, his passion, and now his goodbye. As he closed his eyes, the distant notes of someone else's music drifted through the quarter, proof that the great conversation of jazz continued, with or without him. His part in that conversation, he knew, would echo long after the night was through, not in recordings or written histories, but in the invisible architecture of influence that shapes each generation of musicians. The saxophone lay silent now, its brass gleaming in the moonlight like a sentinel keeping watch. Antoine felt a profound peace settle over him, deeper than exhaustion, more complete than sleep. Whatever came next, whether hours, days, or weeks remained, he had completed his true final performance. The rest was just coda. In the quaint town of Olivier, nestled between rolling hills and dense oak forests, stands a Victorian mansion shrouded in decades of rumors. The Olivier house, with its weathered brick facade and ornate iron fence, has remained unoccupied for 20 years, yet locals swear they sometimes see a pale face watching from the third-floor window. Some dismiss it as reflection or imagination, but others claim the watcher is Annie Olivier, the young wife who disappeared from the property in 1973. The mystery deepened when new owners attempting renovations reported inexplicable cold spots and tools moving overnight. When a construction worker captured a blurry photograph of what appeared to be a woman's silhouette in the window of an empty room, the legend of the window watcher was cemented in local lore. The morning frost clung to the wrought-iron gate like crystallized breath as Marcus Thorne pushed it open. It groaned beneath his touch, as if the house itself was sighing at the arrival of yet another skeptic. Marcus, a paranormal debunker with a YouTube channel boasting 500,000 subscribers, had heard about the Olivier house from 3 separate viewers. Each message described the same phenomenon: a woman's face, gaunt and expressionless, appearing in the 3rd-story window at precisely 3:17 a.m. The oddly specific time intrigued him more than the apparition itself. The air inside the foyer felt heavier than outside, weighted with dust and stillness. Marcus ran his fingers along the mahogany banister, leaving trails in the gray film that had settled there like sedimentary layers of time. His footsteps echoed through the empty rooms, each sound bouncing back as if the house was answering him. Though Marcus had investigated supposedly haunted locations across 3 continents, something about this place raised the fine hairs on his neck, not fear exactly, but a sense of being measured by unseen eyes. "Let's see what secrets you're keeping," he murmured, setting up the first of his cameras aimed at the notorious window. The equipment was a stark contrast to the faded Victorian wallpaper peeling in long strips down the walls. Marcus worked methodically, placing thermal sensors, motion detectors, and audio recorders throughout the 3rd floor. The rooms were curiously intact, as if the previous owners had simply vanished mid-life rather than moved out. A hairbrush still held silver blonde strands on a vanity table. A book lay open on a nightstand, its pages yellowed and brittle. As darkness settled across Olivier like a heavy blanket, Marcus reviewed town records he'd collected. Annie Olivier had been 23 when she disappeared, recently married to Joseph Olivier, 30 years her senior and heir to a modest railroad fortune. Police reports noted no signs of struggle, no farewell note, just a missing nightgown and hairbrush. Joseph reported her missing 3 days later, claiming he'd been away on business. No body was ever found. No charges were ever filed. Joseph died 8 years later, the house passing through a series of owners, none staying longer than 18 months. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the empty corridors like a warning. Marcus checked his cameras, adjusted his light, and settled into the chair facing the window. The wooden seat creaked beneath him, conforming to his weight as if remembering the shape of someone else who once sat there watching. Outside, the moon slid behind clouds, throwing the room into deeper shadow. Marcus wasn't typically one for atmospheric suggestions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't empty. It felt occupied, attentive, patient. At 2:55 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped 7 degrees in 3 minutes. Marcus's breath became visible, small clouds of condensation that dissipated like ghosts themselves. His equipment registered the change, sensors blinking more rapidly as if excited by the development. The logical part of his mind cataloged potential explanations: faulty heating systems, drafts through unseen cracks, the natural cooling cycle of old houses. But another part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, wondered if something was gathering itself in the room with him, pulling cold from the air to form some semblance of presence. At 3:16 a.m., the lights on his equipment dimmed slightly, power draining though his batteries were new. And then, precisely at 3:17, Marcus saw her, not in the window as reported, but reflected in it. Standing behind him. The house on Maple Street looked different in daylight. Softer somehow, less imposing than it had appeared in the darkness when Marcus first glimpsed the face in the window's reflection. After spending the night huddled in his car, clutching his camera with white-knuckled hands, he returned at dawn with a renewed determination to understand what he'd witnessed. The face had been young, feminine, with eyes that held neither malice nor peace, just a profound weariness, as if existence itself had become exhausting. Marcus approached the 3rd-floor room again, this time armed with more than equipment. He carried town records, old newspapers, and a notebook filled with hastily scrawled theories. The morning light streamed through the window where he'd seen the reflection, casting prismatic patterns across the faded carpet. Dust motes danced in the beams like tiny constellations, undisturbed by his presence. The cold that had permeated the room hours before had vanished, replaced by the stuffy warmth of trapped summer air. Settling cross-legged on the floor, Marcus spread his research materials around him like a protective circle. The official story was simple. Annie Olivier, young bride of wealthy Joseph, had likely run away from an unhappy marriage. But as Marcus dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged like bones working their way up through disturbed soil. Annie had no family to return to, no friends reported seeing her after her disappearance, and most tellingly, her bank accounts remained untouched. Where does a woman with no money and no connections go? The answer might lie in the photograph Marcus had discovered in the town library archives, a snapshot of the Olivier house taken for an insurance assessment in 1974, a year after Annie's disappearance. In the third-floor window, barely visible but unmistakable once noticed, was the outline of a woman's profile. The insurance company had dismissed it as a curtain or shadow, but Marcus recognized the same weary gaze he'd encountered hours before. A noise from downstairs interrupted his thoughts, the distinct sound of footsteps on creaking floorboards. Marcus froze, listening. The steps were light, almost tentative, moving across the entryway toward the stairs. His rational mind suggested another urban explorer or perhaps a local official checking on the property. But the footsteps had an odd cadence, like someone unfamiliar with walking, each step a deliberate act rather than an unconscious movement. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding smaller than intended in the vast emptiness of the house. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch into infinity, they began again, this time ascending the stairs with slow, methodical precision. Each creak of the wood felt like a physical pressure against Marcus's chest. He scrambled for his camera, driven by professional instinct even as his pulse thundered in his ears. The steps reached the second-floor landing, then continued upward. Marcus positioned himself facing the doorway, camera held before him like a shield. The third-floor hallway remained empty, yet the footsteps continued, growing closer with each passing second. Then they stopped, just outside the door. The air thickened, making each breath an effort. The doorknob remained motionless, but Marcus felt rather than saw a presence enter the room, a shifting of atmosphere, a compressing of space. "Annie?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hammering of his heart. Something cold brushed against his cheek, gentle as a lover's caress. The sensation lingered for a moment before traveling to his ear, where Marcus felt the distinct impression of lips close enough to touch. Then came the whisper, so faint he nearly missed it, not his name, not a threat, but three words that chilled him more deeply than any ghostly encounter he'd ever fabricated for his channel. "He's coming back." Behind him, the window suddenly filled with a reflection that wasn't his own, a man's face, weathered and stern, with eyes cold as January frost. The reflection vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Marcus alone with his racing heart and the lingering chill of unseen lips near his ear. He scrambled backward, colliding with the antique dresser. A small jewelry box tumbled to the floor, its lid springing open upon impact. Inside lay a single item, a tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. With trembling fingers, Marcus lifted it, feeling its weight, heavier than its size suggested, as if carrying more than metal and memory. The locket resisted his attempts to open it, decades of oxidation sealing it shut. But as his thumbnail found purchase along the seam, it surrendered with a soft click. Inside was a faded photograph of Annie, her smile uncertain, her eyes already harboring the weariness he'd witnessed. Opposite her image was a small key, no larger than his pinky nail, secured to the locket's interior with yellowed adhesive. Marcus worked it free carefully, sensing its importance without understanding why. "What were you trying to hide, Annie?" he murmured, turning the key over in his palm. It was ornate for its size, with an unusual cruciform bit that suggested a very specific lock. Marcus surveyed the room with new purpose, seeing it not as a haunted space but as a crime scene preserved in time. The house hadn't become haunted after Annie's disappearance. It had been keeping her secrets, patient as a tomb. The wall adjacent to the window featured wainscoting with decorative panels running its length. Marcus ran his fingers along each one, searching for inconsistencies. The third panel from the window felt different, not in texture, but in the sound it produced when tapped. Hollow, where the others were solid. Heart pounding, he pressed and prodded until something gave way with a soft click. The panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small compartment holding a leather-bound journal. The diary's pages were brittle with age, the handwriting changing from the flowing script of a hopeful bride to the jagged scrawl of a frightened prisoner. Annie's words painted a grim portrait of her marriage to Joseph, his jealousy, his cruelty, his obsessive control. The final entry, dated 3 days before her reported disappearance, contained a single line. "He knows about the baby. God help me." A sound at the doorway yanked Marcus from his reading. The caretaker, an elderly man with rheumy eyes and gnarled hands, stood watching him with open suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "The house doesn't like strangers disturbing her rest." "Her rest? Or her secrets?" Marcus asked, holding up the journal. "Annie Olivier never left this house, did she?" The caretaker's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," he replied, his gaze drifting to the window. "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed." "I think Annie wants her story told," Marcus countered, rising to his feet. "I think that's why she shows herself at exactly 3:17, the time of death on her death certificate. The one filed by her husband claiming she died of fever while they were traveling abroad. A death certificate I found in town records, dated 3 months after she supposedly ran away." The caretaker said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Outside, clouds gathered over Olivier House, casting the room in premature twilight. The air grew dense with unspoken confessions, with histories buried beneath floorboards and sealed behind walls. In that moment, Marcus understood that some hauntings weren't supernatural at all. They were echoes of justice denied, of truths suppressed, of victims silenced. "Joseph Olivier never left either, did he?" Marcus asked quietly. "He's buried somewhere on these grounds. Annie didn't disappear. She escaped him the only way she could." A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the single candle Marcus had lit hours before. In the sudden darkness, the caretaker's features seemed to shift, age falling away like a discarded mask. For an instant, brief but unmistakable, Marcus saw the stern face that had reflected in the window. "Some houses keep their secrets," the man said, his voice now deeper, resonant with authority and threat. "And some secrets keep houses." He extended his hand, palm up. "The journal and key, please. They don't belong to you." Behind the caretaker, in the shadows of the hallway, the pale figure of a woman materialized like mist condensing from air. Her eyes locked with Marcus's, one hand pressed protectively over her abdomen, the other pointing downward, toward the cellar, toward truth, toward long-denied revelation. The choice crystallized before him: surrender the evidence and walk away, or follow Annie's guidance into darkness that had waited half a century to be illuminated. Marcus slipped the key into his pocket and clutched the journal tighter. "You're right," he said, meeting the caretaker's increasingly hostile gaze. "They don't belong to me. They belong to her. And I think it's time Annie Olivier finally had her day in court." The French Quarter of New Orleans holds many secrets, but perhaps none as enduring as the ghostly presence said to haunt the Dauphine Orleans Hotel. On the corner of Dauphine and Bienville Streets stands this historic establishment, which once housed May Bailey's Place, one of the city's most notorious brothels during the late 19th century. The building's scarlet past has left an indelible mark on its walls, with many claiming that May Bailey herself, the formidable madam who once ruled this den of pleasure and sin, still watches over her domain from beyond the grave. The hotel, with its wrought-iron balconies and old-world charm, draws tourists seeking a taste of New Orleans' colorful history, but few realize they may be sharing their accommodations with spectral residents who never checked out. Room 415, in particular, has become infamous among staff and guests alike, a place where the veil between our world and the next seems as thin as morning mist on the Mississippi. Here, in what was once part of May Bailey's sporting palace, the ghost of a young woman in a flowing white dress has been reported to appear without warning, her melancholy presence a cold whisper from another time. The story of May Bailey and her lingering presence begins not with death but with life, vibrant, complicated life in a city that has always danced on the edge of propriety. In 1857, when New Orleans pulsed with trade, music, and the complicated racial dynamics of the pre-Civil War South, May Bailey established her business in the building that would later become part of the hotel. The city had designated a specific area for such establishments. The infamous Storyville district would come later. But even before official sanctions, certain streets had gained reputations for housing ladies of the evening and the establishments where they worked. May was not born into this profession but chose it with the cold calculation of a woman who understood that in a man's world, certain enterprises could provide both independence and power. She ran her business with an iron hand, demanding proper behavior from both her girls and their clients. In a time when women had few rights and fewer opportunities, May carved out a kingdom of sorts, albeit one built on the commodification of desire. Her place attracted wealthy businessmen, politicians, and even, so the stories say, Confederate soldiers on leave during the Civil War. Among these young soldiers was a certain lieutenant, whose name has been lost to history but whose tragic romance with one of May's girls has become the cornerstone of the hotel's ghostly reputation. The young woman, often called Millie in modern tellings though her real name is unknown, fell deeply in love with this officer. They planned to marry, to escape the confines of her profession and the approaching darkness of war. He presented her with a ring, a promise of a future that shimmered like a mirage in the Delta heat. But promises made in times of conflict are often as fragile as glass figurines. The lieutenant was killed in battle before their wedding day, leaving his betrothed heartbroken and adrift. Some versions of the tale claim she took her own life, unable to bear the weight of her grief. Others suggest she simply wasted away, becoming a ghost in life long before she became one in death. What remains consistent is the belief that her spirit never left the building where she experienced both love and devastating loss. As New Orleans changed through the decades, so too did May Bailey's establishment. After Storyville was officially closed in 1917 due to pressure from the U.S. Navy, many brothels shut their doors permanently or went underground. May's place eventually transformed, becoming part of what would later be the Dauphine Orleans Hotel. The building's history was whitewashed for a time, as was common with many historic structures that had served less than respectable purposes. But walls hold memories, and some say they also hold souls. The transformation from brothel to boutique hotel did nothing to dislodge the spirits that had taken up permanent residence. If anything, the renovations and the constant flow of new people seemed to stir up paranormal activity, as if the ghosts were bewildered by the changes to their familiar surroundings. Staff members began reporting strange occurrences, objects moving without explanation, doors opening and closing on their own, the sensation of being watched when alone in certain rooms. The ghost of May Bailey's establishment was not willing to be forgotten, even as the city around it evolved. Guests at the Dauphine Orleans often report encounters that defy rational explanation. A newly married couple staying in room 415 woke to find a woman in white standing at the foot of their bed, her figure translucent in the moonlight filtering through the window. Before they could process what they were seeing, she vanished, not walking away or fading gradually, but disappearing in an instant like a candle flame extinguished by a sudden breath. They checked out the next morning, unable to shake the chill that had settled into their bones despite the humid New Orleans air. Other visitors have described hearing a woman's soft weeping coming from empty rooms or feeling invisible hands adjust their clothing or luggage. Hotel staff have become accustomed to these reports, often responding with knowing nods rather than surprise. One longtime employee recounts finding a room in perfect order after a guest claimed it had been ransacked during a brief absence, except for a distinctive ring-shaped impression on the bedspread, as if someone had placed a piece of jewelry there and then removed it. The most commonly cited spirit is that of the heartbroken bride, still wandering the halls in her white dress, perhaps searching for her lost love or simply unable to move beyond the moment her future shattered. But others claim to have seen May Bailey herself, described as a stern-looking woman in Victorian dress, often spotted near what was once her office. Unlike her former employee, May's presence isn't associated with sadness but with a watchful, protective energy, as if she's still overseeing her domain and those within it. Paranormal investigators have flocked to the hotel over the years, armed with EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and digital recorders. Many have captured unusual readings and unexplainable phenomena. One team recorded a female voice clearly saying, "He promised to return," but no women were present in the room. Another captured a thermal image of a cold spot in the perfect shape of a human figure, standing motionless in a corner of room 415. These findings have only enhanced the hotel's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in a city already famous for its ghostly residents. The Dauphine Orleans has leaned into its haunted history, offering guests information about its spectral inhabitants, and even naming its bar, May Bailey's Place, in honor of the brothel that once operated there. Inside, framed sporting house licenses and historic photographs give patrons a glimpse into the building's colorful past. Yet even as the hotel commercializes its ghosts, staff members maintain a respectful attitude toward their unseen coworkers. "You don't mess with May or her girls," one bartender explains with a serious expression. "They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone." What keeps these spirits tethered to the Dauphine Orleans? Psychic researchers suggest that intense emotion can leave an energetic imprint on a location, a theory that would certainly apply to a place where love, desire, heartbreak, and desperation once mingled freely. Others propose that those who die with unfinished business or unfulfilled promises may remain earthbound, unable to move on until some resolution is achieved. In the case of the lieutenant's heartbroken lover, perhaps she still waits for a reunion that can never come, caught in a loop of eternal expectation. May Bailey's motivation for remaining might be simpler: the fierce protectiveness she felt toward her business and the women who worked for her. In life, she created rules and boundaries to keep her girls safe in a dangerous profession. Perhaps in death, she continues this mission, watching over the space that was once her kingdom and the spirits of those who remain with her. Her presence is felt most strongly when female guests or staff members are alone in the building, as if she's still keeping watch over women who enter her domain. Some modern visitors to the Dauphine Orleans seek out these paranormal encounters, booking room 415 specifically in hopes of meeting the ghostly bride or feeling the cool touch of spectral fingers on their cheek in the night. Others stumble upon the hotel's haunted reputation only after experiencing something they can't explain. Either way, the stories continue to accumulate like layers of paint on the hotel's historic walls, each guest adding their own brushstroke to the portrait of this haunted establishment. 13 doors unlocked, 13 stories revealed, but countless more haunt the historic hotels of New Orleans' French Quarter. The spirits are always waiting for new guests. Will you be next to experience these supernatural encounters? Subscribe now for more terrifying tales that will keep you awake long after the video ends.